In the stillness of a quiet Texas night, a little girl's life ended behind closed doors. What followed was not silence, but a decades-long battle, where truth clawed its way past lies, and for women refused to let a child be forgotten. The night air over the Texas Gulf Coast carried a damp chill, the kind that clings to the skin and settles deep into the bones. Along Interstate 90, a small procession of vehicles moved steadily through the darkness. A hearse at the front, flanked and followed by police escorts. Their headlights cut into the mist, white beams stretched long over the asphalt, glowing faintly in the drizzle. Inside the hearse lay the body of a 2-year-old child, lifted hours earlier from a grave in a small cemetery. This was no ordinary transfer of the dead. This was an exhumation. Brazoria County, Texas, had never conducted such a thing before. The very act of disturbing a grave had carried with it a weight of dread and ritual. To those present, it felt like moving backward through time, like watching a funeral service in reverse. The officers assigned to accompany the body did not speak. They sat in silence, their hands gripping the wheel or folded against their uniforms, as if to acknowledge the solemnity of the cargo they protected. At the Alvin Community Hospital, other officers were waiting, prepared to guard the casket through the night. No one would be allowed to approach it without clearance. Not for curiosity, not for pity, certainly not for interference. This was about truth, about prying open the sealed silence of a child's grave in the hope that science could finally answer what whispers, suspicions, and courtroom disappointments had left unresolved. Waiting anxiously elsewhere that night was a woman in her 40s. Auburn hair pulled neatly back, dressed with more care than the occasion should have demanded. Her name was Sharon Couch. She was the grandmother of the child who had been exhumed, and for months she had lived with the torment of doubt and fear. Sharon wasn't a woman prone to vanity, but tonight she had taken care with her appearance, perhaps to steady her nerves, perhaps to feel dignified as she welcomed the forensic pathologist flying in from Florida. This doctor, a respected expert in forensic pathology, was not just another specialist. To Sharon, he represented hope. If his hands and eyes could detect what others had overlooked, then perhaps her granddaughter's death would finally be acknowledged for what she believed it was. Not a tragic accident, but something deliberate, something monstrous. By the time Sharon pulled into Houston Intercontinental Airport, her knuckles white around the steering wheel, the rain had thickened. She repeated a prayer under her breath, though she was not an especially religious woman. It was a prayer not just for strength, but for clarity, for a sign that the fear that had haunted her every waking thought was not madness, but truth pressing to be heard. Elsewhere in Alvin, Detective Sue Dietrich lay awake in her modest home, the unease so heavy that sleep was impossible. Dietrich was a veteran investigator, someone who had seen her share of blood and cruelty. She had been present at countless crime scenes, endured autopsies, sat across from murderers who lied with practiced calm. But she had never experienced anything like this, waiting for the second autopsy of a child who had been pulled from her grave. It wasn't the sight of death that unnerved her. It was the uncertainty of what she might find. The case had lingered in the margins for months, shrouded in conflicting reports, inconclusive evidence, and a gnawing suspicion that the system had failed. For Dietrich, this was not just another investigation. It had become personal, a test of her resolve to see through the fog of manipulation and deceit. By morning, the hospital's exam room was prepared. Sterile cabinets lined the walls, instruments laid out with precision. The fluorescent lights cast an unforgiving brightness across the tiles, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant, though beneath it lingered the sweeter, heavier odor of decay. The pathologist, calm and methodical, worked through hours of examination. Each incision, each photograph, each note spoken into his recorder was another piece of the puzzle. Detective Dietrich stood nearby, her stomach tightening, her hands trembling despite her efforts to appear steady. Sharon waited outside, pacing, her nerves strung tight as piano wire. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the doctor peeled off his gloves, exhaustion etched into his face. He looked across the gurney to Dietrich and spoke the words that would forever change the trajectory of the case. "Detective," he said quietly. "You now have a homicide investigation on your hands." Those words cracked open a new reality. What had been brushed off as uncertain, what had been clouded in ambiguity, was now starkly defined. A child had been murdered. But to understand how a 2-year-old ended up in a grave, only to be pulled back into the cold light of forensic science, we must step backward in time. We must enter the lives of 3 women: Sharon, the grandmother; Annette, the mother; and Sue, the detective, whose determination against odds and opposition would eventually drag the truth into daylight. We must also meet the man at the center of it all, Michael Shane Goode. It was spring break, 1987, on the beaches of Galveston. The Gulf waters lapped lazily at the shore, the sand alive with college students seeking escape in beer, marijuana, and fleeting romance. Among the crowds was Shane Goode, dark-haired, athletic, and outwardly charming. He looked like any other young man soaking up the party atmosphere. But Shane wasn't a carefree student. He was a postal worker from nearby Pasadena, his marriage already unraveling, his ambitions already faltering. Shane had come to Galveston not for books or exams, but for something else. A taste of freedom, a chance to reinvent himself, if only for a weekend. That was when he spotted Annette Tollett, a shy, pretty brunette visiting with her cousin. Annette had been through her own hardships. A young divorce, the responsibilities of raising a small daughter named Michelle, and the lingering bruises of an abusive first marriage. Shane approached her with easy charm. He told stories of his time in the military, spoke with affection about his own daughter, Tiffany, from his first marriage. He made Annette feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. She gave him her number, and soon they were inseparable. The courtship was intoxicating. Flowers, notes left on her car, evenings of dinner and dancing. It was everything Annette's wounded heart longed for. Within weeks, she and little Michelle moved into Shane's trailer. To her, it felt like a new beginning, the chance at a stable, loving family she had craved. But beneath Shane's polished surface lay something darker. An obsession with control, a quick temper, and a taste for cruel games that left scars not on the body but on the mind. At first, Annette's mother, Sharon, was pleased. She saw her daughter's eyes light up again, the dullness of heartbreak replaced with optimism. Shane seemed polite, even deferential, though he rarely spoke much in Sharon's presence. When he did, it was in clipped replies, his gaze fixed downward, as though the carpet held more interest than conversation. But Annette was smitten. Shane was attentive, romantic, and, perhaps most importantly, he appeared to adore her little girl. To a young mother carrying the weight of single parenthood, that devotion was priceless. Soon the talk of marriage came. Plans were made, invitations sent. But 2 days before the wedding, Shane announced he wasn't ready. He loved Annette, he insisted, but the timing was wrong. It was a bewildering reversal. Annette was devastated, left to make the humiliating calls to cancel the event. 2 months later, Shane returned, contrite and persuasive. This time, the wedding was rushed and intimate. No grand ceremony, no gathering of friends. Just a quick exchange of vows before Annette's mother and daughter. Shane's family was conspicuously absent. From the outside, it looked like young love overcoming a rough start. But inside the marriage, shadows began to form quickly. Shane's moods shifted unpredictably. Days of affectionate warmth would curdle into sullen silences, then into sharp bursts of anger. He wasn't physically violent, but his cruelty came in subtler forms, twisting affection into punishment, withholding kindness at moments that should have been joyful. On their first Christmas together, he presented Annette with a large, beautifully wrapped box. She opened it eagerly, only to find inside her own worn shoes, plucked from the closet. Shane laughed at her stunned face, telling her it was just a joke. He seemed to savor her disappointment. Birthdays came and went without acknowledgement, despite his habit of reminding her of the date in advance, as though to heighten the sting of his neglect. When they went dancing with friends, he would sulk and vanish, forcing Annette to beg for explanations that never came. His jealousy bordered on obsession, cloaked in declarations of love but sharp in its demand for control. Sharon, perceptive but cautious, began to sense something was wrong. She noticed how her daughter's once independent spirit seemed to shrink in Shane's presence. Yet she held her tongue. Annette was stubborn, fiercely protective of her choices. Any criticism of Shane would only drive a wedge between mother and daughter. For a while, things seemed manageable. Shane worked as a mail carrier, proud of his steady government job, and boasted about his commitment to the National Guard. He spun stories of military exploits, of survival training and combat skills, painting himself as a man of discipline and danger. To some, he was impressive. To others, he seemed like a man desperate to convince himself he mattered. But his past was darker than Annette knew. His first marriage had ended in violence. His ex-wife, Kay, had once been struck so hard in public that her eardrum ruptured. Shane had been convicted of assault and placed on probation. He told Annette a different story, painting himself as the victim of a vindictive woman who wanted to cut him off from his daughter. Annette, blinded by love and loyalty, believed him. What she didn't know, what he didn't share, were the stories of cruelty he told with chilling pride. Stories of catching stray cats as a boy, burying them in the ground with only their heads exposed, then mowing them down with a lawnmower. Whether the stories were true or not, the relish with which he told them was revealing enough. Annette's world began to shrink under Shane's control. Friends drifted away, unwelcome in a home where Shane's sulking presence made visitors uncomfortable. Money became a constant strain. Shane criticized Annette's spending, though he himself orchestrated financial schemes that bordered on criminal. One night, their brand-new Pontiac Trans Am vanished from a nightclub parking lot while they danced inside. Shane raged, called the police, and filed an insurance claim. The car was never found. The payout cleared their debts and left extra cash in his account. Later, whispers suggested that Shane himself had orchestrated the theft, enlisting Annette's younger brother, Stephen, to help. It was a pattern: charm, control, deception, and a trail of quiet destruction. By 1988, Annette was pregnant. She glowed with the excitement of bringing a child into the world with the man she loved, hopeful that motherhood would bind them closer. But during the move to a new home, Annette, against her mother's pleas, lifted heavy furniture and boxes. She miscarried soon after. Sharon's grief was mingled with fury at Shane, whose indifference to Annette's condition seemed almost deliberate. Still, Annette clung to him. That was the cruelest part. Her love for Shane was stubborn, defiant. She shouldered blame for their conflicts, convinced that if she just tried harder, was more patient, more forgiving, their marriage would heal. But Shane played games with her heart. Days before her college finals, he announced he was leaving. Her grades plummeted under the weight of his words. On Thanksgiving, he abandoned her to spend the holiday with his family, leaving her to plead through tears over the phone for his return. And then, with the casual cruelty of a man who thrived on confusion, he would change course. He'd return, smiling as though nothing had happened, and Annette would cling to the hope that this time would be different. One December, she discovered lease papers for a new apartment Shane had rented in secret. When she confronted him, he coldly confirmed he was moving out. Yet days later, he softened, telling her to buy a Christmas tree together, as though their life wasn't unraveling. She decorated the tree with him and little Michelle, trying to believe in the fragile fantasy of family. But when Christmas passed, Shane stripped the ornaments from the branches, packed his belongings, and left. Annette's world collapsed. She fell into depression, barely eating, unable to sleep. Yet even then, she didn't hate him. She longed for him. To friends and family, it was incomprehensible. To Annette, it was love. The backdrop to this turbulent marriage was Houston, a city of wealth and grit, where ambition burned hot but often consumed more than it delivered. It was a place where fortunes were made and broken overnight, where crime simmered in the shadows of oil wealth. For couples like Shane and Annette, the city's harsh rhythms only magnified the cracks already spreading in their lives. By early 1989, Annette and Michelle moved back in with Sharon. The mother watched helplessly as her daughter carried the wreckage of her marriage like an anchor around her neck. Annette's love for Shane had survived humiliation, abandonment, even cruelty. She could not or would not let go. And somewhere in the shadows of all this, a tragedy was forming. One that would eventually bring detectives, doctors, and grandmothers together in pursuit of the truth buried beneath a child's small headstone. Sharon Couch had always considered herself practical, not easily rattled by life's disappointments. A single mother, she had raised Annette and Stephen largely on her own after her marriage ended, holding down steady work and keeping the household intact as best she could. She believed in resilience. But watching her daughter unravel in the wake of Shane's manipulations pushed even Sharon's patience to the brink. What puzzled her most was Annette's unwavering devotion. No matter how callous Shane's behavior, Annette clung to him with a desperate loyalty. Sharon often sat awake at night on her back porch, staring into the haze of Houston's polluted sky, replaying the choices that had led here. Where had she gone wrong? Had she failed her daughter by not being stricter, or by not showing enough affection? The questions gnawed at her in silence. Meanwhile, Annette's younger brother Stephen was spiraling in his own way. He had slipped into drug use, petty trouble, and dangerous company. His recklessness soon collided with a young man named Rodney Richards, whose girlfriend's car Stephen had foolishly arranged to be stolen as a prank. What began as a childish stunt erupted into a vendetta. Rodney stalked Stephen for months, threatening him with knives, firing bullets into the Couch home, making it clear he would never forgive or forget. This ongoing feud brought further instability into Sharon's household, and strangely, it drew Stephen closer to Shane. The two bonded, not as brother-in-law and teenager, but as co-conspirators. Shane seemed to encourage Stephen's worst instincts, pulling him into his orbit. It was Stephen, after all, who was suspected of helping Shane dispose of the stolen Trans Am. Annette remained mostly in the dark about these dealings. What she saw was a husband who drifted in and out of her life with merciless unpredictability. One week he would storm out, declaring their marriage a mistake. The next, he would return with flowers, speaking of a future together. Each time, Annette welcomed him back, hopeful that the Shane she had fallen for, the one who once brought her roses and whispered promises, might reappear for good. But that Shane was only a mask. Beneath it lay a man who relished control, who fed on the vulnerability of others. In the spring of 1989, Shane dangled reconciliation again. He phoned Annette without warning, telling her he had been thinking about moving back in. Her heart leapt at the possibility. She asked him to come over, desperate for answers. They sat at her kitchen table, awkward at first. She poured out her feelings, explaining how hard life had been without him. Raising Michelle, keeping up with bills, trying to juggle school and work. She begged him to tell her what she had done wrong. If he could only point to her mistakes, she promised she would change. Shane listened in silence, his expression cold. Then, with a dismissive shake of his head, he stood. "I was thinking about coming back," he said flatly. "But after hearing you talk like that, forget it." Annette broke down, sobbing. And in that moment, he allowed himself a small smile, savoring the control he had reasserted. It was always the same game: reel her in, then cut the line. By February of that year, the financial strain had forced Annette to give up the house she could no longer afford. She and Michelle moved back into Sharon's home. For Sharon, it was confirmation of what she had feared all along. Shane was a destructive force, and her daughter was caught in his undertow. But Annette didn't see it that way. Even as she unpacked her belongings in her mother's spare room, her thoughts remained tethered to him. She still defended him, still explained away his cruelty, still believed that somehow, some way, their love would prevail. The years ahead would prove otherwise. For Shane, financial desperation was becoming a constant companion. Child support for Tiffany drained his paycheck. Arguments with Annette about money escalated. His solution was never to tighten his own belt or seek steadier ground, but to find shortcuts, schemes, manipulations, and, increasingly, acts that blurred the line between desperation and criminality. One evening, while Annette nursed the lingering ache of dental surgery, Shane disappeared for hours on what was supposed to be a quick trip to the pharmacy. What she didn't know was that he had been finalizing a lease on a one-bedroom apartment. A secret plan to walk out on her yet again. When she found the papers, she confronted him. His reaction was as callous as ever. A shrug, a curse, and a reminder that he had warned her he might leave. But days later, with whiplash predictability, he softened, suggesting they decorate a Christmas tree together. That tree, glowing with ornaments Annette had chosen with care, stood as a fragile beacon of hope. But after the holiday, Shane stripped it bare, packed his belongings, and left. To Annette, it felt as if he had taken not just the ornaments, but the very fabric of her heart. And yet, in this pattern of cruelty and reconciliation, a deeper menace lurked. Shane's manipulations were not random tantrums of a troubled husband. They were rehearsals, smaller stages upon which he refined the tools of control, deception, and emotional torment. Annette was learning, painfully, that his love came with conditions. And Michelle, her young daughter, was growing up in a household where affection was twisted, where stability was an illusion, where the line between love and cruelty blurred. No one, not Sharon, not Annette, not even the watchful detective Sue Dietrich who would later take on this case, could yet see the full arc of what was coming. But the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The little girl who would one day be exhumed from her grave, carried in silence down a Texas highway toward a second autopsy, was already living in the shadow of Shane Goode's darkness. By the time the 1990s approached, Shane Goode's double life was no longer just the story of a troubled marriage. It was becoming the stage for a far darker tragedy. On the surface, Shane still projected an image of stability. The steady postal worker, the dutiful father who claimed to love his daughter Tiffany, the National Guardsman who wrapped himself in patriotic pride. But those who knew him well, his ex-wife Kay, his estranged in-laws, and even his new wife Annette, saw glimpses of something else. A man whose moods shifted without warning, who thrived on control, and who seemed to enjoy sowing confusion and pain in those closest to him. Annette, however, clung to the memory of the man who had once courted her with roses and tenderness. That man still surfaced from time to time, just often enough to rekindle her hope, to convince her that if she only loved him enough, he would stay. She carried this belief like a torch, even as it scorched her hands. For Sharon Couch, watching her daughter endure this cycle was agonizing. Sharon had always been pragmatic, a survivor of her own failed marriage and the struggles of single motherhood. She saw Shane with a clarity Annette refused to admit. To Sharon, he was not just a bad husband, he was dangerous. But what could she do? Every time she voiced concern, Annette recoiled, defending Shane, interpreting her mother's warnings as judgment rather than protection. It was a familiar dance between mother and daughter, one that left Sharon simmering in silence while her granddaughter, little Michelle, lived inside the storm. Meanwhile, Shane's private struggles only deepened. Money was always at the center. His child support payments for Tiffany gnawed at his paycheck, leaving him bitter. Annette's desire to return to school for nursing frustrated him. To Shane, education was a waste, an investment of time and money that did not bring immediate gain. He preferred shortcuts, insurance scams, emotional manipulation, schemes that put others at risk while he played the victim. One such shortcut had been the staged theft of the red Trans Am, a ploy that brought him insurance money and temporary relief. But it also drew his teenage brother-in-law, Stephen, further into his orbit. Stephen, already troubled and reckless, seemed to idolize Shane's bravado. To Sharon, the sight of her son bonding with a man she mistrusted was another source of sleepless nights. Stephen's life had already been marked by danger. His feud with Rodney Richards, the relentless young man who blamed Stephen for the theft of his girlfriend's car, had escalated into years of harassment, violence, and near-deadly encounters. Rodney slashed at him with knives, fired bullets into Sharon's home, stalked the family with an obsession that bordered on madness. In that crucible, Stephen gravitated toward Shane, who seemed to relish having the teenager's loyalty. For Sharon, it was a nightmare. One child entrapped in a marriage to a manipulative man, the other caught in a deadly feud with a vengeful predator. And in the middle of it all, her granddaughter Michelle, a bright, innocent child, was being raised in a house that was anything but safe. Annette tried to hold the pieces together. She balanced schoolwork, childcare, and her hope that Shane might return for good. Each time he reappeared at her door, she forgave him. Each time he left, she blamed herself. Her daughter watched all of this with the uncomprehending eyes of childhood. To Michelle, Shane was not a monster but a father figure, sometimes affectionate, sometimes distant. She could not yet know that the man who tucked her in at night, who played at being the head of the household, harbored a capacity for cruelty that would one day make her the victim of his darkest impulses. And yet, in hindsight, the warning signs were everywhere. Shane's bizarre sense of humor, his obsession with control, his manipulations of Annette's emotions. These were not isolated quirks. They were patterns, rehearsals for a much greater harm. By the close of the decade, Annette was exhausted. Her life with Shane had become a pendulum of heartbreak and fleeting hope. Sharon, weary of watching her daughter suffer, often found herself in quiet prayer, not because she was especially religious, but because the weight of fear demanded some outlet. She prayed for her daughter's strength, for her granddaughter's safety, for her son's survival in the crosshairs of Rodney Richards. What none of them knew was that the storm was about to break wide open. The simmering tensions, the cycles of manipulation, the shadows of financial desperation. All of it was leading toward a single, devastating event. The tragedy that would soon unfold would not only claim the life of a child, but also test the resolve of three women: Annette, Sharon, and Detective Sue Dietrich, who would each, in their own way, fight to bring the truth to light. And when that truth finally came, it would not be whispered. It would be carved into the record by forensic science, courtroom battles, and the relentless determination of those who refused to let a child's murder be buried beneath excuses and lies. The story of To the Last Breath begins not with an answer, but with a question. How could a man, trusted as a father, as a husband, as a protector, bring harm to the very child he was meant to keep safe? The answer, as it would turn out, was more complex, more insidious, and more disturbing than anyone dared imagine. The summer heat in Pasadena, Texas, can feel like a weight pressing down on the chest. Even in the shaded corners of small homes and trailer parks, the air hangs thick, oppressive, as though nature itself conspires to drain the spirit. It was in this atmosphere that the fragile marriage between Annette and Shane Goode staggered forward into its final, devastating act. Annette was trying, always trying. She enrolled in classes, hoping to build a better life for herself and her daughter. She kept the home as orderly as she could, cooked Shane's favorite meals, made excuses for his mood swings. But nothing was ever enough. Shane wielded his discontent like a weapon, reminding her in subtle ways that she was failing, that she wasn't worthy of him. By then, his jealousy had hardened into something more sinister. Friends were unwelcome. Even family visits felt fraught. Annette's world shrank until it seemed her only purpose was to anticipate Shane's moods, to shield her daughter from his storms, and to hope against hope that one day his affection would return for good. Michelle, just a toddler, sensed more than she could articulate. Children often do. She knew when to stay quiet, when to play in her room, when to retreat from the rising tension in the air. To her grandmother Sharon, these were troubling signs, though she tried to believe that her daughter's marriage, like so many, might weather its hardships and find stability. But Sharon also knew her son-in-law's eyes too well by now. There was something behind them that never quite matched the words he spoke. A flatness, a cold distance, as if the warmth he sometimes showed was nothing more than a mask he slipped on and off at will. The details of what happened next would later be reconstructed in courtrooms, in autopsy reports, in testimony pieced together like fragments of a shattered mirror. But what is certain is this: by early 1990, a 2-year-old child was dead, and the official explanation would not satisfy the people who loved her most. When Renee, Annette, and Shane's infant daughter was pronounced gone, the cause was listed in vague terms. A sudden illness, a tragic collapse, an unexpected tragedy that, while devastating, could not be clearly explained. Shane, calm and composed, told the story of a child who simply stopped breathing. He spoke of attempts to revive her, of desperate calls for help. On the surface, it was a scene of grief. But beneath the surface, questions festered. The inconsistencies in Shane's account. The way he had behaved in the hours leading up to the child's death. The fact that Annette herself, in her grief-stricken haze, could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Sharon's suspicions grew heavier by the day. A mother's intuition is one thing. A grandmother's is another entirely. She had watched Shane long enough to know that his calmness was not the calm of despair but the calm of calculation. Yet in the immediate aftermath, the system moved as it so often does, quickly, clinically, eager to assign closure. Death certificate issued, cause listed, funeral arranged, tiny casket lowered into the ground. Community grieved politely and moved on. But Sharon could not, and neither eventually would Detective Sue Dietrich. For months, the truth lay buried with Renee. The questions whispered only in private conversations between Annette and her mother. Was it possible that Shane, this man who had once wooed Annette with roses, who played with her children, who held himself out as a loving father, had been capable of killing his own child? It was almost unthinkable. And yet, when Sharon replayed the years of manipulation, the cruelty dressed as jokes, the pattern of control and sudden eruptions of anger, she began to see that the unthinkable might also be the undeniable. But suspicion is not proof. It would take courage, persistence, and the intervention of outsiders willing to risk their careers and reputations to reopen what others wanted to leave closed. That is why, in October of 1994, the quiet of a Texas cemetery was broken by the scraping of shovels, the lifting of a casket, and the unheard cries of a grandmother whose love for her granddaughter demanded nothing less than the truth. Back at Alvin Community Hospital, the second autopsy stretched on for hours. Every incision, every photograph, every note etched into the record became a small victory for those who had fought to reach this moment. When the pathologist at last removed his gloves, his conclusion was clear. This was not an accident. This was not an unexplained illness. "Detective," he said, his voice steady but heavy, "you now have a homicide investigation on your hands." And so the story truly began. Not just the story of a child's tragic death, but of three women. Annette, the mother, trapped in the cycle of love and cruelty, who would have to confront the darkest truth imaginable about the man she loved. Sharon, the grandmother, whose determination and intuition kept the case alive when others wanted it buried. And Detective Sue Dietrich, the investigator who refused to accept easy answers, who pressed forward even when resistance threatened to crush the case. Together, these women would form an unlikely alliance, bound by grief, suspicion, and a relentless pursuit of justice. What lay ahead would test them all, against Shane's manipulation, against a legal system wary of reopening old wounds, and against a society reluctant to believe that a father could commit such a crime. But they would not stop. Not until the truth was dragged into the light. Not until the last breath of justice was claimed. The verdict of the pathologist had cracked open a door that many in Alvin, Texas, would have preferred to leave closed. It was one thing to bury a child with the explanation of illness or accident. It was another entirely to exhume her body years later and declare, with clinical certainty, that what lay before them was evidence of murder. For Detective Sue Dietrich, the words hit with both relief and dread. Relief because her instincts had been vindicated. She had suspected from the beginning that something darker lurked beneath the surface of the case. Dread because naming a homicide was only the beginning. Naming the killer and proving it would be far harder. In small towns like Alvin, suspicion spread quickly, and yet silence spread even faster. To accuse a father of murdering his own child was to ignite whispers, rumors, and an unease that cut deep into the fabric of the community. People wanted to believe in family, in love, in the natural order of things. The idea that a parent could commit the ultimate betrayal unsettled everyone. But for those closest to the case, Annette, Sharon, and Sue, the evidence was mounting into a story that could not be ignored. Annette was still caught between two worlds. On one hand, she clung to the memory of Shane as the man who had swept her into romance, who had filled her lonely heart with attention and flowers. On the other hand, she was haunted by the knowledge that her life with him had been a carousel of manipulation, humiliation, and sudden abandonment. The death of Renee had shattered her in ways words could not capture. A mother losing a child is a wound that never heals. But the possibility that Shane, her husband, the man she had once defended against her mother's suspicions, might have been responsible was almost too much to bear. To acknowledge it would mean that her love had been a cage, her trust a weapon turned against her. Sharon, however, did not waver. Her suspicion of Shane had hardened into certainty. She had seen enough of his cruelty, heard enough of his contradictions, to believe that her granddaughter's death was not the act of fate. Sharon's grief was fierce, but it was also fuel. She refused to let Renee be reduced to a statistic, another case filed away under unknown causes. It was Sharon who had pushed for the exhumation, who had pressed officials, demanded answers, and endured the humiliation of being dismissed by some as an overbearing mother-in-law unwilling to accept tragedy. And now, with the pathologist's conclusion, her resolve was vindicated. The investigation that followed would dig not only into the death of a child, but also into the tangled history of Shane Goode. It would unearth the wreckage of his first marriage to Kay, the violent outbursts, the probation for assault, the manipulations he practiced long before Annette came into his life. It would reveal a man whose charm was thin veneer, whose pride in his military training masked an obsession with control, and whose financial desperation drove him to deception. It would also reveal, painfully, the extent to which Annette had been ensnared in his games. Her loyalty, her forgiveness, her refusal to see the truth until it was too late. All of it would be laid bare in the courtroom and the court of public opinion. For Detective Dietrich, the path forward was daunting. Building a case meant more than suspicion. It meant proof hard, irrefutable, beyond a reasonable doubt. And Shane was not the kind of man to confess or crumble under questioning. He was calculating, often quiet, and skilled at presenting whatever mask the situation demanded. But what he could not control were the patterns he left behind. The lies, the financial schemes, the testimonies of women who had seen his cruelty firsthand. The task now was to weave those threads into a tapestry the law could not ignore. The first step for Detective Sue Dietrich was to strip away the layers of Shane Goode's self-presentation. On paper, he appeared ordinary, steady job, National Guard service, 2 marriages, a father to 2 little girls. But Sue had learned in her career that paper rarely told the truth. She started by revisiting the autopsy findings. The Florida pathologist had been meticulous. Tiny signs of deliberate interference with the child's breathing, details overlooked in the original postmortem, were now stark. Where the first doctor had chalked the death up to tragedy without explanation, the second saw intention. Patterns of trauma, subtle but telling, marked Renee's small body. That finding alone shifted the case from a closed file to an open homicide. But Sue knew better than to rely on science alone. A defense attorney would argue doubt into every microscopic detail. To bring this case to trial, she needed motive, behavior, and testimony that painted a portrait of Shane not as a grieving father, but as a man capable of cold cruelty. She began digging into Shane's first marriage. Kay, his ex-wife, had lived through years of his mood swings and cruelty. She remembered the chilling jokes he used to play, like wrapping an empty box and promising pearls inside, only for her to find dime store beads. She remembered his simmering jealousy, the way he twisted affection into punishment. And she remembered the violence. The night he struck her so hard her eardrum ruptured, leaving her bleeding and humiliated in a convenience store parking lot. Kay's testimony painted Shane as a man who thrived on dominance, whose sense of humor was cruelty, and whose control extended to every corner of his household. The court records backed her up. The assault conviction, the probation, the child support order that drained him financially and filled him with resentment. To Sue, this was more than background. It was motive. A man who resented financial obligations, who saw his first daughter as a burden, could very well see a second child, born into another strained marriage, as an obstacle to be removed. At the same time, Sharon Couch offered her own testimony. She spoke of her growing suspicion over the years, the moments when Shane's coldness chilled her to the core, the indifference he showed even when Annette was vulnerable or ill. She described the way Annette's world had shrunk under his control, how Shane's presence seemed to darken every room. Most haunting of all were Sharon's recollections of the day Renee died. The details shifted with Shane's retelling, but what remained consistent was his unnatural composure. Where a father should have been frantic, devastated, Shane seemed controlled, almost rehearsed. Sharon could never shake the feeling that she was watching a man play a part, not a man in genuine grief. Annette herself was harder to reach. Even in the wake of Renee's death, she wavered. Love is a stubborn thing, and denial even more so. To admit that Shane had killed their daughter was to admit that the man she had defended for years, the man she had welcomed back time and again, had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. In her interviews with Sue, Annette oscillated, sometimes recounting Shane's jealousies, his manipulations, his cruel jokes, other times insisting that he loved her and would never hurt their child. The push and pull mirrored the very cycle she had lived inside her marriage. Sue knew she could not force Annette to see what she was not yet ready to face. But she also knew that if this case was to succeed, Annette's eventual clarity would be essential. Building the case felt like stitching together fragments of a nightmare. The autopsy that revealed homicide, the ex-wife who confirmed a history of cruelty, the grandmother who refused to be silenced, the wife still caught in the undertow of denial, and at the center of it all, Shane Goode, quiet, calculating, outwardly ordinary, yet leaving behind a trail of broken trust and bruised spirits. Sue had built homicide cases before, but rarely one so steeped in shadows. The challenge wasn't only to prove that Renee had been murdered. It was to cut through the fog of manipulation that Shane had woven around everyone in his orbit. The deeper detective Sue Dietrich dug, the more she realized that Shane Goode's life was a maze of contradictions. On one side, he presented himself as a dutiful postal worker, a committed National Guardsman, a man of discipline. On the other, there were schemes, lies, and a simmering bitterness that seemed to guide his every decision. Money was a constant theme. He earned steadily, but obligations drained him. Child support to his ex-wife Kay, car payments, rent, utilities, his budget bled red. Rather than tightening his belt, he turned to shortcuts. The theft of the red Trans Am stood out. On paper, it was a random act of misfortune. A car stolen from a nightclub parking lot, reported dutifully to police. But whispers suggested otherwise. Annette's younger brother Stephen confided to friends that Shane had orchestrated the theft, enlisting him to drive the car away and sell it through shady channels. The insurance payout wiped away the looming debt, left Shane with extra cash, and gave him a taste of what deception could yield. This was Shane's pattern. When cornered, he didn't adapt, he manipulated. In her interviews with co-workers, Sue uncovered another side of him. At the post office, he was often cocky, quick to criticize others though he had no real authority. Among National Guard peers, he exaggerated his skills, painting himself as a survival expert, a man trained to kill without leaving a trace. It was bravado, but dangerous bravado, the kind that revealed how he wanted to be seen. Not just as a soldier, but as a predator. To Annette, however, he wore another mask. He alternated between affection and cruelty, weaving her emotions into knots. He would shower her with love notes one week, then ignore her birthday the next. He would plan a future together, then rent a secret apartment behind her back. He thrived on the power of destabilizing her, making her desperate for his affection and unsure of her own worth. Psychologists call this cycle coercive control, a form of abuse where the victim's reality is reshaped by the abuser's moods and manipulations. Annette lived inside it every day, and because she still loved him, she defended him, even when her mother Sharon pleaded with her to see the truth. Sue began charting Shane's life like a map. Early cruelty as a boy, with the chilling stories of burying stray cats and mowing them down. The violent outburst against his first wife. The manipulative charm that drew Annette in. The financial schemes to outpace debt. The cycle of jealousy, sulking, and sudden affection. Individually, each thread might seem troubling but not damning. Together, they formed a pattern. A man who sought control at any cost, who masked his insecurity with cruelty, and who left destruction in his wake. Meanwhile, Sharon's determination only grew. She attended every meeting she could, pressed officials for updates, and documented every inconsistency she observed. To many, she was just a grieving grandmother unable to move on. But Sue saw her differently. Sharon's persistence wasn't denial, it was instinct. She had seen too much, heard too much, felt too much in her gut to let the case be dismissed as just a tragedy. Annette remained conflicted, torn between loyalty to Shane and the gnawing suspicion planted by her mother and reinforced by Sue. It was perhaps the cruelest trap of all, to grieve a child while questioning whether the man you love is the reason she is gone. For Sue, the case was becoming more than professional. She felt the weight of Renee's small coffin every time she closed her eyes. It wasn't just about building a file, it was about giving voice to a child who could no longer speak. And to do that, she had to outmaneuver a man who had made manipulation his life's work. The closer Sue Dietrich pressed, the more Shane Goode's carefully arranged masks began to slip. He had always been skilled at presenting the version of himself he wanted others to see. The hard-working postal employee, the dedicated soldier, the attentive father, the charming husband. But under scrutiny, the cracks widened. Shane's story about Renee's death was his most important mask. He had told it with calm precision, detailing a sudden collapse, his desperate efforts to revive her, his confusion as to what went wrong. But when Sue lined up his accounts side by side, small discrepancies appeared. The timing shifted. His description of her final moments changed. His demeanor, described by Sharon and others who saw him that day, was strangely detached. Grief can wear many faces. Some people wail, some collapse, some sit in stunned silence. But Sue had been a homicide detective long enough to recognize the difference between numbness and calculation. Shane's calm was not the stillness of a devastated father. It was the steadiness of a man maintaining a story. To build her case, Sue needed allies. She found them in Sharon and in Brazoria County Assistant District Attorney Jerry Yen, who saw in the exhumation report the foundation for prosecution. But even with their support, the path forward was fraught. The law demands more than suspicion, more than instinct. It demands proof that will stand up in court, withstand the cross-examination of skilled defense attorneys, and convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Sharon's role in all of this was relentless. She gathered documents, pressed prosecutors, kept notes of every conversation she had with Annette. Some dismissed her as overbearing, even obsessive. But others began to realize that her obsession was simply love weaponized into determination. Her granddaughter was gone, but she would not allow the story of Renee's death to be written by the man she believed had taken her life. Meanwhile, Shane continued to live as if nothing were wrong. He carried himself with the same quiet cockiness, still worked his postal route, still played the part of the steady guardsman. But beneath that routine, he was under pressure. The whispers were growing louder. Investigators were circling. Annette remained caught in the undertow. She wanted to believe in Shane. She needed to believe that her love hadn't been misplaced, that the man who once filled her life with flowers and attention wasn't capable of harming their daughter. But every conversation with her mother chipped at her defenses. Every interaction with Sue pulled her closer to the unbearable truth. It was as if she stood between two worlds, one where Renee's death was a tragic accident, and another where it was deliberate murder. Crossing into the latter meant not only losing her child, but also admitting that the man she loved had destroyed everything. For Sue, this tension was not a distraction. It was central. Cases like these aren't just about evidence. They're about people. How they see the world, how they process loss, how they choose to speak or stay silent. If Annette remained in denial, the case would be crippled. But if she reached the point where she could acknowledge Shane's cruelty, her testimony could become the most powerful weapon in the prosecution's arsenal. So Sue watched. She listened. She waited. She knew that people caught in webs of manipulation often broke free not in an instant, but in slow, painful increments. By the mid-1990s, the alliance of women, Sharon with her persistence, Annette with her wavering courage, Sue with her investigative skill, was slowly shifting the balance. Shane might have controlled the narrative at first, but now the narrative was slipping away from him. And in the shadows, the quiet question grew louder. If he could harm Renee, what else was he capable of? How far had his darkness already spread? Hidden behind the polite smile of a postal worker and the uniform of a soldier, the answers, Sue knew, would come only with more digging. And she was prepared to dig until the truth, no matter how ugly, was unearthed. The walls around Shane Goode were beginning to close, though he was too arrogant, or perhaps too deluded, to see it. For years, he had cultivated an image of control. He controlled the way Annette saw him, alternating between tenderness and cruelty. He controlled the way neighbors and co-workers perceived him, slipping into whatever role the moment required. He even controlled the narrative of his daughter's death, shaping it into a story of sudden tragedy. But control is fragile when truth begins to surface. The second autopsy had cracked the foundation. The testimony of his ex-wife Kay and mother-in-law Sharon widened the fissures. And now, with Detective Sue Dietrich piecing together every inconsistency, every lie, every manipulation, the structure Shane had built around himself was beginning to collapse. Still, Sue knew that evidence alone wasn't enough. To win in court, she had to paint a full picture. Not only of what happened, but of who Shane truly was. She needed the jury to see past the quiet demeanor and steady job. She needed them to see the man who had mocked his wives with cruel jokes, who had struck Kay so hard her eardrum burst, who had left Annette sobbing in despair time and time again. She needed them to see a man who, when backed into a corner by finances, staged the theft of his own car. A man who manipulated a vulnerable teenager, his own brother-in-law, into becoming complicit in his schemes. A man who told stories of mowing down cats as a boy, and who seemed to relish cruelty for its own sake. The law demands proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but people understand patterns. And Shane's patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. Sharon's role grew larger with each step. She was not content to sit quietly, waiting for updates. She pressed prosecutors, followed up on every lead, and reminded anyone who would listen that Renee was not just a name on a file. She was a child, a granddaughter who had deserved protection, not betrayal. Her persistence sometimes irritated officials who preferred clean cases and cooperative families. But Sharon didn't care. Her resolve came from a place deeper than protocol. She had promised herself that her granddaughter's death would not vanish into silence. And if that made her a nuisance to some, so be it. Annette, meanwhile, was living in a private hell. Grief for Renee consumed her, but so did guilt. She had chosen Shane. She had defended him. She had brought him into Michelle's life. To admit that he had killed their child was to confront her own deepest fears, that she had allowed the wolf into her home. At first, she clung to the accident narrative. It was easier, less crushing. But as time passed, the cracks in Shane's story widened. She replayed his moods, his coldness, his odd calmness after Renee's death. She remembered Sharon's warnings, Sue's questions, the pathologist's conclusion. The denial that once shielded her was now breaking down. Slowly, painfully, Annette began to shift. Her certainty wavered, but her suspicion grew. And for Sue, that shift was everything. By late 1994, the pieces were aligning. The forensic evidence had named homicide. The ex-wife confirmed a history of abuse. The grandmother provided the voice of persistence. And the mother, wavering though she was, began to edge closer to acknowledging the unthinkable. For Sue, the task was no longer about whether Shane Goode had killed his child. It was about proving it in a courtroom where every doubt would be magnified, every hesitation exploited. The trial to come would not just weigh evidence. It would expose the darkest corners of Shane's life, drag into the light the manipulations, the cruelty, the quiet arrogance that had gone unchecked for years. And at the heart of it would stand three women. Sharon, the grandmother, whose determination refused to let the case die. Annette, the mother, struggling to reconcile love with truth. Sue, the detective, methodical and relentless, pushing the investigation forward against resistance. They were, in many ways, unlikely allies bound not by choice but by tragedy. Yet together, they carried the weight of justice on their shoulders. The stage was now set. The exhumation had confirmed homicide. The investigation had revealed patterns of cruelty. The women had begun to find their voices. Ahead lay the courtroom battles, the cross-examinations, the desperate maneuvers of a man cornered by his own lies. Ahead lay the public exposure of the secrets Shane had hidden behind his quiet smile. And ahead, for Annette, lay the hardest confrontation of all. Not with Shane, but with herself. To admit what he had done meant shattering the last remnants of the love she had once believed in. But truth has a way of demanding its place. And in the case of little Renee, the truth was no longer willing to remain buried. The decision to treat Renee's death as a homicide changed everything. What had once been written off as a tragic accident was now the subject of a full-scale murder investigation, and the ripple effects spread far beyond the small circle of family and investigators. In Alvin and Pasadena, whispers turned into full-blown rumors. Neighbors debated the possibilities in hushed tones. Could Shane really have done it? Could a father murder his own child? The questions hung heavy, not only because of the horror they implied, but because Shane did not fit the caricature of a killer. He wasn't a drifter, a stranger lurking in shadows. He was a postal worker, a guardsman, a husband and father. He lived in their neighborhoods, drove their streets, and nodded politely at the grocery store. That was precisely what made the allegations so chilling. If a man like Shane could be capable of such a crime, then no community, no home was as safe as people wanted to believe. Detective Sue Dietrich pressed forward with the kind of quiet relentlessness that unnerved those who underestimated her. She wasn't one for theatrics or grand pronouncements. Her style was steady, methodical. She understood that cases like this weren't won with a single dramatic revelation, but with hundreds of details, each checked, rechecked, and stacked carefully until they formed a wall no defense attorney could climb. She began by revisiting the timeline of Renee's final day. The accounts from Shane and Annette differed in small but crucial ways. Shane described events with clinical detachment, as if reading from a prepared script. Annette's memories were more fractured, colored by grief, guilt, and the haze of shock. Sue mapped both versions side by side, circling every inconsistency. She then turned to medical experts, building on the Florida pathologist's work. Pediatric specialists weighed in. The injuries, though subtle, bore the unmistakable signs of suffocation. The evidence pointed not to accident, but to deliberate force. And crucially, there was no scenario in which Renee could have inflicted such trauma on herself. This was homicide. The question now was whether Shane Goode could be tied to it beyond doubt. For Annette, the pressure was unbearable. She was caught in a tug-of-war between loyalty and truth, love and horror. Every conversation with Sue pulled her closer to facing the possibility that Shane had killed their daughter. Every interaction with Shane afterward dragged her back into denial. Shane knew how to exploit that conflict. He reminded Annette of their good times, of their passion, of the family they still had. He portrayed himself as the victim of suspicion, targeted unfairly by her mother, by police, by a world that didn't understand him. And Annette, desperate to make sense of her pain, often wavered. To doubt him meant doubting herself. But cracks were forming. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Annette replayed the details that didn't add up. She remembered the way Shane's face looked that day. Not devastated, but oddly composed. She remembered his jealous rages, his cold jokes, his secret apartment. And she began, slowly, to imagine the unthinkable. Sharon, however, no longer imagined. She was certain. Her mistrust of Shane had hardened into conviction, and she would not let the case fade. She pushed Annette to see the truth, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully. Their relationship, already strained by years of tension over Shane, now carried the weight of life and death. It was Sharon who gave Sue the emotional backbone of the case. While Annette wavered, Sharon never did. While officials hesitated, Sharon demanded action. Her voice, sharp and unwavering, echoed through every step of the investigation. But even as the case against Shane grew, Sue understood a hard truth. Motive mattered. A jury needed to understand not just how Renee died, but why. Without that, Shane's defense could cast doubt, paint him as a father caught in tragedy. and so Sue dug into his life with renewed focus. What she uncovered painted a picture of a man who saw his children not as gifts, but as burdens. Child support drained him. Responsibility irritated him. His obsession with control left no room for weakness, even in a toddler. Piece by piece, Sue was assembling the kind of story that juries understood. A man cornered by life, angry at the weight of obligations, and capable of the unthinkable when he decided a child had become an obstacle. Detective Sue Dietrich's next move was to trace Shane's history of lies through those who had lived closest to him. If there was one thing she had learned, it was that patterns of behavior rarely stayed hidden forever. People who manipulate leave behind debris. Broken trust, half-truths, whispered warnings from those who once believed them. She began with his family circle. Shane's own relatives had long since learned to navigate his moods, though most stopped short of condemning him outright. To them, he was difficult, temperamental, sometimes cruel, but still blood. They spoke cautiously, often as if measuring their words against the loyalty they felt bound to offer. It was Annette's family who spoke more openly. Stephen, her younger brother, eventually admitted the truth of the Trans Am theft. He described how Shane had lured him into the scheme, convincing him to drive off the car in exchange for cash. For Stephen, it was reckless mischief. For Shane, it was insurance fraud dressed as ingenuity. To Sue, it was another brick in the wall. Evidence that Shane not only lied but manipulated others into carrying out his lies for him. Sue also revisited Kay, the first wife. Kay's testimony was searing. She described a marriage that began with charm and ended in terror. She spoke of the jokes that humiliated her, of the beatings that left her broken and bleeding, of the night she sat sobbing in a convenience store parking lot with a ruptured eardrum while Shane shrugged off her pain. Her words painted Shane not as a tragic father, but as a man whose cruelty escalated whenever he felt slighted or out of control. In Kay's story, Sue found the foundation for motive. If Shane had been willing to harm his wife to assert power, was it so unthinkable that he might harm a child who disrupted his carefully balanced world? Meanwhile, Annette's own memories became sharper in hindsight. She told Sue of moments that, at the time, had seemed strange but not alarming. The way Shane sometimes withheld affection from Renee, as though punishing even a toddler for failing to meet his expectations. The way he mocked Annette for spoiling the baby when she showed tenderness. The way his eyes sometimes turned flat and cold when watching the child. In the fog of daily life, these moments had blended into the background noise of their troubled marriage. But now, under Sue's steady questioning, they re-emerged like clues Annette hadn't wanted to see. Sharon was the most direct. She remembered Shane's demeanor after Renee's death with disturbing clarity. Where Annette had been inconsolable, Shane had been controlled, detached, almost clinical. It was like watching someone read lines from a play, she told Sue. He looked like he was acting the part of a grieving father, but nothing in his eyes matched the words coming out of his mouth. Her certainty bolstered Sue's growing case. It wasn't just about forensic evidence anymore. It was about the testimony of those who knew Shane best, each piece adding weight to the portrait of a man who saw people as tools, obstacles, or possessions, but never as equals. The more Sue pieced together, the more she saw a chilling pattern. Shane never erupted randomly. His cruelty wasn't wild or uncontrollable, it was calculated. He punished to remind others who held power. He deceived to maintain control. And when he felt cornered, he cut loose the people or obligations that threatened him. It was that last pattern Sue focused on most. Renee, in her innocence, had no power, no choice, no voice. But to Shane, she was another responsibility, another weight on his strained finances and fragile ego. Eliminating her fit the logic of his life. When in doubt, remove the obstacle. For the prosecution, this was gold. For Annette, it was agony. She began to realize that the man she had once loved so fiercely, the man she had defended against her mother's warnings, might very well have been the destroyer of her child. The realization left her hollow, as if the floor beneath her life had collapsed. But Sue knew that in that collapse was also the possibility of strength. If Annette could accept the truth, if she could summon the courage to speak it, then Shane's control over her would finally break. And with it, his grip on the case. As Sue Dietrich expanded her investigation, she kept circling back to two key areas: money and image. To her, these were the twin engines that powered Shane Goode's life, and they were also the areas most riddled with cracks. Money had always been his weakness. He earned a steady income at the post office and through the National Guard, yet somehow he was always strapped. His first marriage had saddled him with child support. His own tastes, flashy cars, bar nights, expensive gestures meant to impress, outpaced his means. Rather than adapting, Shane reached for shortcuts. The Trans AM scheme had been one. There were also smaller manipulations. Borrowing money from relatives with vague promises of repayment, bouncing checks, quietly letting Annette cover bills when his own paycheck ran short. Individually, these might not have seemed catastrophic. But to Sue, they spoke volumes about character. A man willing to defraud insurers or manipulate family for cash was a man willing to bend morality whenever it suited him. Image was the other side of the coin. At the post office, Shane was quick to criticize colleagues, eager to remind them of his guard training, always angling for the appearance of authority. In the National Guard, he projected toughness, bragging about survival skills and combat readiness. He wanted to be seen as more than an ordinary man. But dig a little deeper and the facade wobbled. Supervisors described him as average, competent but not exceptional. His military peers rolled their eyes at his exaggerated stories. His co-workers recognized his cocky demeanor as little more than bluster. To Sue, this was telling. Shane's self-image wasn't grounded in truth, it was theater. And like all theater, it depended on the audience believing the performance. What struck Sue most was how he used these twin pillars, money and image, to control the women in his life. With Kay, he played the part of a provider, only to humiliate her when she depended on him. With Annette, he painted himself as the strong protector, only to leave her scrambling financially when he withheld support. With both, he fed on their confusion and guilt, knowing that if they doubted themselves, they'd cling tighter to him. It was a cycle of domination, and Renee, though only a child, had been swept into it. Annette remembered moments when Shane's coldness extended even to their daughter. Times when he scolded her for comforting the baby too much. Times when he muttered about responsibility. Times when his eyes turned flat while watching the toddler play. Children don't keep ledgers of cruelty, but mothers remember. And now those memories began to surface with new weight. Sharon, ever relentless, pressed Annette not to dismiss those moments. "You saw it," she told her daughter again and again. "You felt it. You knew something was wrong with him, even if you didn't want to admit it." It was harsh, but Sharon's bluntness was rooted in love. She had watched her daughter lose herself in Shane's orbit, and she had lost her granddaughter in the process. To Sharon, denial wasn't just dangerous, it was betrayal, and she refused to let Annette hide behind it forever. Meanwhile, Sue kept building her mosaic. She gathered testimony from co-workers, guard colleagues, ex-wives, family members. She revisited the autopsy, lining it up against Shane's timeline. She highlighted every financial scheme, every manipulation, every contradiction. Slowly, the portrait sharpened. Shane wasn't just a flawed man caught in tragedy. He was a calculating man whose entire life revealed a willingness to harm when it served his needs. But Sue also knew portraits weren't convictions. Courts demanded more. She would need not just stories but a chain of evidence that left no room for reasonable doubt. That meant more digging, more patience, more nights staring at files until dawn. The path was long, but Sue was resolved. Renee deserved nothing less. By late 1994, momentum was shifting. What began as a grandmother's crusade and a detective's hunch was now evolving into the early framework of a prosecution. The exhumation results were solid, the testimonies mounting, the inconsistencies glaring. The case was no longer a question of if but of when charges would be brought. Inside the Brazoria County Courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Jerry Yen examined the files that Sue had assembled. Yen was pragmatic, sharp, and unafraid to take on difficult cases. But she also knew the risks. Homicides without witnesses or confessions are notoriously difficult. When the victim is a toddler, the challenge is magnified. Children can't testify, and their injuries are often subtle. Yet Yen saw potential. The case had what prosecutors call cumulative weight. One piece of evidence might leave room for doubt, but together, the pieces formed a nearly unshakable picture. The autopsy confirmed deliberate suffocation. The ex-wife proved a pattern of cruelty. The grandmother reinforced suspicions of deception. And Annette, though fragile, was slowly inching toward acknowledging the truth. For Shane, this shift was invisible. He continued to live his daily life as though nothing had changed. He delivered mail on his routes, attended guard drills, and carried himself with the same cocky swagger. To neighbors, he was the same man he had always been, aloof, sometimes arrogant, but hardly a figure of suspicion. That was part of his skill. Shane had always relied on appearances. If he acted normal, if he looked unshaken, people assumed he must be innocent. And in some ways, his calm demeanor worked in his favor until it didn't. Because the very calmness that reassured strangers unsettled those who had seen him up close. To Sue, it was the calm of a man rehearsing his role. To Sharon, it was the emptiness of a man without remorse. To Annette, it was becoming harder and harder to mistake for grief. Annette's shift was gradual but unmistakable. She began recalling incidents that gnawed at her. Shane's refusal to let her comfort Renee when she was sick, his scolding when she picked the baby up too often, the mocking tone in his voice when she cried over small things. These weren't the memories of a devoted father. They were snapshots of control and contempt. Her guilt, too, was growing heavier. She thought back to the warnings Sharon had given her, the doubts she herself had suppressed, the nights she had chosen Shane's assurances over her own instincts. To admit the truth now meant not only grieving Renee but confronting her own complicity in ignoring the signs. It was a burden almost too heavy to bear. But sometimes unbearable burdens force clarity. And slowly, Annette began to tip toward it. Sharon, for her part, never wavered. Her voice in Annette's ear was constant, sometimes tender, sometimes sharp, but always insistent. You know what he did. Deep down, you know? Sharon's persistence strained their relationship, but it also served as an anchor. Where Annette drifted, Sharon held fast. For Sue, watching the two women was like observing tectonic plates shift. Painful, slow, often invisible, but ultimately inevitable. Sooner or later, Annette would cross the line from doubt to certainty. And when she did, the case against Shane would be unshakable. By early 1995, prosecutors were preparing. They knew the defense would argue doubt, would paint Shane as a grieving father hounded by overzealous women. They knew Annette's wavering would be exploited, her hesitations magnified. But they also knew the tide was turning. What they didn't yet know was just how dark the coming revelations would be. Because hidden in Shane's history, in the shadows of his carefully constructed life, were secrets darker than anyone imagined. And as Sue pressed further, she was about to uncover them. The pressure inside Brazoria County's justice system was growing. With every week that passed, more voices joined Sharon's insistence that Renee's death had not been an accident. What once seemed like a grieving grandmother's obsession was now shaping into a credible murder case. And yet, the stakes were daunting. For prosecutors, this wasn't just about proving homicide. It was about dismantling the illusion of Shane Goode. To friends, neighbors, and even Annette for so long, he had seemed normal, even dependable. He worked a government job. He wore a uniform on weekends. He smiled politely in public. Convincing a jury that such a man could suffocate his own daughter would require more than evidence. It would require piercing through every layer of his disguise. That disguise, however, was fraying. Sue Dietrich's methodical digging unearthed cracks that even Shane couldn't plaster over. His financial records showed constant strain, a man juggling obligations he resented. His guard service, far from being exemplary, was marked by mediocrity and empty bravado. His co-workers at the post office described not a reliable employee, but a man quick to shift blame, eager to inflate his role, often irritating rather than inspiring. Piece by piece, Sue gathered proof that Shane was not the man he pretended to be. But the most important piece still lay ahead: motive. Why would a father kill his child? It was the question that jurors would ask, the question the defense would hammer home, the question Sue herself turned over in her mind late at night. The answer, she believed, lay in Shane's lifelong relationship with control. Control over women, control over money, control over appearances. And Renee, though only a toddler, had disrupted that balance. She tied him to obligations he resented, weighed on finances he could barely manage, and diverted Annette's attention away from him. To Shane, control was survival, and Renee's existence had threatened it. It was a dark, almost unthinkable motive, but in Sue's eyes, it fit the man she had come to know through every testimony and every lie. For Annette, the reckoning drew closer with each passing day. She tried to hold onto the fragments of love she had once felt for Shane, the memories of flowers and laughter, of late-night promises. But those fragments were increasingly drowned out by the memories of his cruelty, his indifference, his chilling calm after Renee's death. The human heart does not let go easily, even when it knows it must. Annette's nights became battles, between memory and evidence, between love and truth. Sometimes she woke in tears, caught between the image of Shane she had loved and the reality of Shane she could no longer deny. Sharon remained steadfast, her voice cutting through Annette's turmoil. Don't let him win. Don't let him take both of you. By mid-1995, the file on Shane Goode was thick enough to rival any case file in the county. Sue had built her mosaic. The violent marriage to Kay, the manipulations of Annette, the financial schemes, the chilling autopsy results, the testimonies of family who had seen through the cracks. For prosecutors, the path forward was no longer a matter of if, but of how. How to present the case so that jurors could not look away. How to strip Shane of his masks without allowing him to recast himself as the victim. How to balance the heartbreak of Annette's wavering testimony with the unyielding determination of Sharon's. The case was ready to move forward. But in the shadows, darker truths waited. Because Renee's death, horrifying as it was, might not have been the only tragedy in Shane Goode's orbit. Other stories, other suspicions, other whispers had followed him, whispers Sue was only beginning to chase. And as the case neared the courtroom, those whispers threatened to erupt into revelations that would shock even the most seasoned investigators. By the summer of 1995, Shane Goode's name had become more than a private suspicion whispered among family members. It was a file on prosecutors' desks, a subject of late-night strategy sessions, a man whose carefully cultivated image was giving way to something far darker. Detective Sue Dietrich had built the scaffolding of a homicide case. The second autopsy was the cornerstone. Renee's death was no accident. Around that cornerstone she placed the testimonies of Shane's ex-wife Kay, his manipulations of Annette, the relentless suspicions of Sharon, and the trail of lies that followed him from one scheme to another. But what startled Sue most as she pressed deeper was that Renee's case seemed less like an isolated crime and more like a window into a pattern. Each story, each testimony hinted at something broader. A man who lived his life skirting the edges of violence and deception, and who may have left other casualties in his wake. The whispers began with family. Relatives who had once stayed quiet now admitted suspicions. Kay recalled moments when she feared for her own life in their marriage, nights when Shane's anger seemed to teeter on the edge of something irreversible. Annette, too, began sharing fragments of conversations. Dark jokes Shane had made, comments that, in hindsight, carried an edge of menace. Even within the guard, where Shane liked to project himself as a warrior, colleagues remembered troubling details. His casual stories of violence, his odd fascination with death, his eagerness to make himself seem hardened, as though cruelty were a badge of honor. To Sue, none of this was coincidence. These weren't simply quirks of personality. They were threads in the same fabric, the fabric of a man whose cruelty was not accidental but ingrained. At the same time, prosecutors began mapping out what a trial would look like. Assistant DA Jerry Yen knew they faced steep challenges. The defense would seize on Annette's wavering, her lingering reluctance to outright accuse Shane. They would exploit the lack of direct witnesses, the absence of a confession. They would argue that grief looked different on everyone, that Shane's calm demeanor after Renee's death was stoicism, not guilt. But Yen also knew they had powerful weapons. The autopsy evidence was undeniable. The history of abuse was damning. and Sharon's steadfast testimony gave the case a moral clarity few jurors could ignore. The challenge would be weaving it all together in a way that jurors could feel in their bones. For Annette, this period was one of unbearable tension. She lived in a state of limbo, caught between the man who still occupied her home and the truth that now haunted her every waking moment. At times, she found herself defending Shane almost reflexively, out of habit, out of fear, out of the desperate desire not to believe. But then she would see his eyes, hear his mocking words in memory, and feel her stomach twist with suspicion. Shane, sensing her distance, turned up his manipulations. He portrayed himself as the persecuted one, a man unfairly targeted by her mother, by police, by prosecutors desperate to pin a tragedy on someone. He leaned on her with guilt, reminding her that she was all he had left. For a while it worked. Annette swayed back and forth, her loyalty tugged in both directions. But beneath it all, the truth was eroding her defenses. Slowly, her silence began to give way to questions she could no longer ignore. And as Annette's certainty wavered, Sue's determination only hardened. She knew the case was approaching a breaking point. She also knew that before it reached trial, even more secrets were waiting to be unearthed. Secrets that would widen the case beyond the death of one child and reveal the full extent of Shane Goode's darkness. Detective Sue Dietrich had learned long ago that the past has a way of bleeding into the present. When a suspect commits one terrible act, it is rarely their first. Violence leaves echoes, sometimes faint, sometimes hidden, but always there for those willing to listen. So as she dug deeper into Shane Goode's life, she began asking a chilling question. Had there been others? The first hints came from Shane's own stories. In interviews with guard colleagues and co-workers, Sue uncovered a disturbing pattern of anecdotes. Shane spoke casually about cruelty, often wrapping it in the disguise of humor. One fellow guardsman recalled him joking about running over cats as a boy, laughing at the sound they made when struck. Another remembered Shane describing fights in bars where he seemed to take more pride in the intimidation than the outcome. Individually, these recollections could be dismissed as bravado or bad taste. Together, they painted a picture of a man who derived satisfaction from domination, whether over animals, rivals, or the women closest to him. Then came the darker whispers. Some family members, once hesitant to speak, began sharing concerns that Renee's death wasn't the first tragedy to cast a shadow over Shane's orbit. An ex-girlfriend described moments when she felt Shane's anger could easily have turned deadly. A cousin remembered stories of Shane roughing up smaller kids in their youth, always needing to prove his strength. And then there was Kay. She had survived Shane's worst rages, but she admitted to Sue that there were nights she believed she might not survive at all. His violence wasn't random, she explained, it was purposeful, calculated. He struck when he wanted to remind her that he held the power, that her body and spirit were his to control. Hearing Kay's testimony again, this time with the context of Renee's death, Sue shuddered. To her, it was no longer just spousal abuse, it was a blueprint for escalation. If Shane had been willing to break his wife to assert control, was it really so impossible that he would eliminate a child who disrupted his authority and drained his resources? As Sue traced Shane's movements in the months before and after Renee's death, another pattern emerged. His financial desperation. Bills piled up. Obligations mounted. His frustration grew sharper, his resentment deeper. To a man like Shane, children weren't only emotional responsibilities, they were financial ones. Renee's very existence demanded money he didn't want to spend, attention he didn't want to give. Motive was beginning to crystallize. Annette, meanwhile, was living a different kind of torment. For her, the widening investigation wasn't abstract evidence. It was personal revelation. Each new detail Sue uncovered forced her to re-examine her memories, to reinterpret moments she had once brushed aside. The night Shane insisted she was spoiling Renee. The way he dismissed her tears with a smirk. The coldness in his eyes as she held their child. She began to realize that she had always known, somewhere deep in the quiet corners of her mind. She had seen it, felt it, but buried it beneath layers of denial and hope. Now, with Sue's relentless pursuit of the truth, Those buried instincts rose to the surface like corpses long hidden underwater. It was unbearable, but it was also undeniable. Sharon saw the shift in her daughter. At first, Annette's words were cautious, hedged with maybes and I don't knows. But over time, Sharon heard the certainty creeping in. Annette began saying the words out loud, haltingly at first, then with more conviction. Shane might have killed her. Shane probably killed her. Shane killed her. For Sharon, it was both devastating and vindicating. She had fought for this truth from the beginning, often feeling like the lone voice against a wall of indifference. To finally hear her daughter speak, it was both a breaking and a healing. Still, Shane remained free, walking the same streets, delivering mail, attending drills, spinning lies. That, more than anything, fueled Sharon's determination. It was not enough to know the truth, it had to be proven. Renee's story had to be told in a courtroom, where Shane's masks would finally be stripped away, and Sue knew that moment was coming. The case was no longer just a file or an investigation. It was a storm gathering force, building toward a trial that would decide whether Renee's death remained a tragedy without justice, or became the foundation of Shane Goode's reckoning. In the Brazoria County Courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Jerry Yen spread the files across a long oak table. To an outsider, they might have looked like a jumble of reports, autopsy notes, and witness statements. But to Yen, they were the skeleton of a narrative, one she would need to flesh out with precision if she had any hope of convicting Shane Goode. The problem was simple but daunting. There were no eyewitnesses. No one had seen Shane put his hands on Renee. There was no confession, no smoking gun. What they had was circumstantial evidence, powerful, layered, but still indirect. Yen knew defense attorneys thrived on those gaps. They would argue that the autopsy was inconclusive, that the signs of suffocation could have been accident. They would say Shane was guilty only of being stoic in his grief, that Sharon was blinded by dislike, that Annette was confused and vulnerable. They would frame him not as a killer but as a father being devoured by rumor and resentment. So Yen's task wasn't only to present facts. It was to tell a story, one that made sense of every inconsistency, one that jurors could believe in their bones. The autopsy wouldn't stand alone. It would be placed next to Kay's testimony of abuse, Sharon's testimony of deception, Annette's growing acknowledgement of her husband's cruelty, and Shane's own lies. The story would be cumulative. And if she told it right, the jurors would see Renee not as an accident, but as the inevitable victim of a man who had always lived by control, deceit, and cruelty. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Shane was fighting a quieter battle. The battle to keep Annette under his influence. He sensed her slipping, felt the subtle changes in her voice, the questions she asked that she hadn't before. His survival instinct told him she was drifting toward the other side, and that frightened him more than any prosecutor. So he turned up the charm. He bought small gifts, cooked dinners, cracked jokes. He leaned heavily on the image of himself as the misunderstood victim. "They're trying to tear us apart," he told her. "Don't let them win." At times, Annette faltered. Old habits are hard to break, and Shane knew how to exploit every crack. He reminded her of the intimacy they had shared, the family they had built. He painted a picture of a future together, if only she would stand by him. But it was different now. For the first time, Annette began to see the script for what it was, a performance. Where once she heard love, now she heard manipulation. Where once she saw strength, now she saw desperation. Sharon noticed the shift, too. Annette still struggled, still wavered, but her eyes had changed. They no longer held the blind devotion of a wife in denial. They carried the haunted look of a mother beginning to face the truth. For Sharon, it was both a relief and a torment. She wanted to shake her daughter, to scream the truth she had always known. But she also recognized the fragility of Annette's journey. If she pushed too hard, Annette might retreat again. So Sharon tempered her fire, offering comfort as often as she offered hard truths. It was the most delicate balance of her life. Through it all, Shane remained outwardly unshaken. To neighbors and coworkers, he was the same man, joking, showing up for shifts, making plans for weekends. But beneath the surface, the walls were closing in. He could sense it in Annette's silences, in Sharon's eyes, in the quiet persistence of Sue's questions. What he didn't realize was that the net was already tightening, and that soon, every mask he wore would be dragged into the unforgiving light of a courtroom. By late 1995, the case file on Shane Goode had grown into a thick binder of contradictions. On one side of the ledger, the image of a father, a guardsman, a postal worker, the kind of man neighbors waved to without suspicion. On the other, the bruising testimony of his ex-wife, the unwavering certainty of his former mother-in-law, the quiet persistence of a detective who refused to let the case fade into silence. Assistant DA Jerry Yen studied the file with a prosecutor's eye. She knew it wasn't yet perfect. Prosecutors rarely walked into trial with perfect cases. But this one was strong, stronger than most. And if they moved too slowly, Shane would remain free to rewrite the narrative, to reassert his control, to intimidate or seduce Annette back into silence. The pressure was building to move forward. A grand jury was discussed. Witness lists were drafted. Potential jury reactions were debated in back rooms thick with cigarette smoke and strategy. The central question was no longer if the case would be brought, but when. Shane, meanwhile, began to show signs of strain. Outwardly, he played the role of calm routine, delivering mail, attending guard drills, flashing the same cocky grin. But behind closed doors, Annette noticed the cracks. His temper surfaced more quickly. He snapped over small things. His attempts at charm felt forced, brittle, as though he knew the performance was wearing thin. For Annette, it was a terrifying shift. She had spent years living in his orbit, conditioned to smooth over his moods, to accept the blame for his anger. But now, with Sue and Sharon feeding her strength, she began to resist. She asked harder questions, pressed back against his excuses. And each time she did, Shane's mask slipped a little further. One evening, as Annette recalled later, she watched him sitting at the kitchen table, leafing through bills. His jaw was tight, his hands restless. When she suggested they could ask her parents for help, his eyes snapped up, cold and sharp. "We don't need them," he said flatly. "We never needed them. All they do is poison you against me." It was a familiar script, but something in his tone unsettled her. It wasn't just anger, it was fear. For the first time, she saw the possibility that Shane himself was afraid. Afraid of Sue's persistence. Afraid of Sharon's certainty. Afraid of Annette's shifting loyalty. Afraid of the truth finally catching up to him. For Sharon, every day felt like a countdown. She had fought too long, carried too much grief, to let the case stall now. Her patience was thin, her resolve sharpened. Whenever she spoke to prosecutors, she pressed the urgency. Don't let him slip through your fingers. Don't let Renee's voice be silenced again. Her words carried weight. To Yen, Sharon wasn't just a witness. She was the conscience of the case. The voice reminding them that behind every legal strategy was the memory of a child whose life had been stolen. By the end of that year, the storm was ready to break. The prosecution's narrative was nearly complete. The evidence was organized. The witnesses were aligned. The time for quiet investigation was drawing to a close. Soon, Shane Goode would no longer be a man delivering mail on a quiet suburban route. He would be a man standing in the glare of a courtroom, his life dissected in front of 12 strangers, his mask stripped away one by one. And when that day came, the battle for Renee's justice would finally begin. The decision to present the case to a grand jury came with a mixture of anticipation and dread. For months, Sue had carried the weight of her investigation, knowing every new lead, every scrap of testimony, was building toward this moment. For Sharon, it was the first real taste of vindication. A sign that the system might finally take her granddaughter's death as seriously as she always had. Inside the courthouse, the mood was tense. Prosecutors methodically laid out their evidence. The second autopsy proving suffocation, the inconsistencies in Shane's story, the history of abuse testified by Kay, the unflinching suspicion of Sharon, the financial motives lurking behind every decision he made. Piece by piece, the portrait of Shane Goode was reconstructed, not as a father mourning a child, but as a man whose need for control outweighed even the bond of blood. The grand jury listened, their faces unreadable. Some leaned back, arms crossed. Others scribbled notes. It was the kind of silence that prosecutors both dreaded and relied upon, the silence of citizens weighing a life against the evidence before them. When the decision came, it was decisive. Shane Goode would face indictment for the murder of his daughter, Renee. For Sue, it was validation of every sleepless night, every interview, every dogged refusal to let the case die. For Sharon, it was a moment of grim relief, a step closer to justice, though nothing could ever bring back the little girl with the bright eyes and tender laugh. For Annette, it was devastating and liberating all at once. To accept the indictment meant accepting that the man she had loved, the father of her child, was now formally accused of being her child's killer. Shane's reaction was characteristic. No tears, no panic. Just a flat, stony insistence that he was the victim of lies and conspiracies. To his family, he presented himself as stoic, as though he were bracing against a storm unfairly hurled at him. But beneath the surface, his fury was palpable. His mask, though still in place, had begun to crack. He told Annette it was all politics, that Sue and Sharon had poisoned the system, that the indictment was proof not of guilt but of betrayal. He leaned hard on her loyalty, reminding her of their vows, their bond, their future. But Annette, though torn, no longer swallowed the script so easily. She had begun to see him clearly, and once seen, the truth could not be unseen. The indictment marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The investigation had revealed the truth, but the trial would decide whether that truth would hold in the unforgiving crucible of a courtroom. For Sue, Sharon, and Annette, the road ahead would demand more strength than they had yet shown. They would have to relive Renee's death again and again, telling and retelling their stories in the hope that 12 strangers would see what they saw, feel what they felt, know what they knew. And for Shane Goode, the stage was finally set. No longer shielded by routine, no longer hidden behind charm or intimidation, he would face the reckoning he had evaded for far too long. The battle for Renee's justice was about to enter its most brutal phase. The courthouse in Angleton, Texas, was an unremarkable building from the outside: brick walls, square windows, a modest lawn dotted with parked cars. But in early 1996, it became the stage for one of the most emotionally charged trials Brazoria County had ever seen. Inside, the air was heavy. The faint hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the shuffle of papers, the muted coughs of reporters, the quiet sobs of family members seated in the gallery. At the center of it all sat Shane Goode, dressed neatly in a collared shirt and tie, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. To those who didn't know him, he looked like any other defendant. Nervous, maybe angry, but not extraordinary. That was the defense's greatest weapon. His ability to look ordinary, to pass as a grieving father unjustly accused. But to Sharon, watching from the front row, that ordinariness was the very mask that had allowed him to escape suspicion for so long. And now, at last, it would be stripped away. Jury selection was the first battlefield. Assistant DA Jerry Yen knew the stakes. Every juror brought their own biases, their own thresholds for doubt. Some would sympathize with a grieving parent. Others might distrust a case built largely on circumstantial evidence. The goal wasn't to find 12 people without preconceptions. That was impossible. The goal was to find 12 people willing to look past appearances and weigh the evidence without flinching. The defense attorneys played their role skillfully. They probed for jurors wary of government overreach, of police investigations that seemed too eager. They looked for people inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to a father accused of the unthinkable. Their strategy was clear. Plant seeds of doubt early, water them through the trial, and hope they grew strong enough to sway even one juror. For days, lawyers questioned potential jurors about their beliefs, their experiences with loss, their attitudes toward law enforcement. The process was painstaking, but by the end, 12 citizens and 2 alternates were seated. Ordinary people, teachers, retirees, office workers, now tasked with judging a man accused of murdering his own child. The opening statements set the tone. Prosecutor Yen stood first. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying the weight of the case without theatrics. She told the jury about Renee, her short life, her sudden death, and the evidence that showed it had not been natural. She spoke of Shane's history, the patterns of control, the inconsistencies in his story. She promised that the evidence, though circumstantial, would be powerful and unshakable. "This case," she said, "is about a little girl who should still be alive, and about the man who decided she wouldn't be." The defense followed with equal conviction. Their tone was indignant, almost outraged. They painted Shane as a man persecuted by bitterness and suspicion, a victim of a mother-in-law who had never approved of him, a detective who refused to let go of a theory, and a system too quick to blame. They reminded the jury that grief takes many forms, that stoicism is not guilt, that circumstantial evidence is not certainty. They promised that when all was said and done, the picture would not be of a murderer, but of a father devastated by tragedy. As the trial began in earnest, the atmosphere inside the courtroom grew taut. Every word mattered, every glance was scrutinized. For Sharon, the pain of reliving Renee's death was searing, but she endured it for one reason: the hope that at last justice might be done. And for Shane, seated at the defense table, the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a battle for his very identity, whether he would remain, in the eyes of the world, an ordinary man unjustly accused, or be unmasked as something far darker. The prosecution's first witnesses were chosen with deliberate care. Jerry Yen knew that before the jury could understand Shane Goode, they had to understand Renee's death. It wasn't enough to say she had suffocated. The jurors needed to see, in clinical detail, why her passing could not be explained away as chance or accident. The medical examiner took the stand, a calm presence in a gray suit, his voice even and steady. He spoke in measured terms, using the language of science, yet each word carried the weight of finality. He began with the basics: Renee's age, her general health, the absence of congenital conditions that might explain sudden death. Then he guided the jury step by step through the autopsy, his words painting an image none of them could easily forget. There were subtle signs, he explained, that pointed to suffocation. Petechial hemorrhages, tiny pinpoint bleeds, appeared in the eyes. There was congestion in the lungs inconsistent with natural causes. The heart was healthy. The organs showed no disease. He paused, letting the silence carry the gravity of his conclusion. "In my opinion," he said firmly, "Renee did not die of natural causes. She died because her breathing was cut off." The defense rose swiftly for cross-examination. Their strategy was clear: sow doubt, blur the lines, suggest alternate explanations. They asked whether petechiae could result from CPR. The examiner conceded it was possible, but not in this pattern, not with the other signs present. They asked whether sudden infant death syndrome could apply, even though Renee was older than the typical range. Again, the examiner explained why it didn't fit. The defense pressed hard, but the examiner did not waver. His answers remained steady, precise, grounded in evidence. The jurors listened intently, some leaning forward, their expressions solemn. For Sharon, sitting just feet away, the testimony was both agony and vindication. Each detail carved deeper into her grief, yet each word affirmed what she had always known. Renee had not simply slipped away in her sleep. Someone had taken her breath. After the medical examiner, the prosecution began to weave in the human threads. Paramedics described arriving at the Goode home, finding Shane eerily calm, detached in a way that struck them even at the time. One recalled how unusual it was for a parent not to panic, not to plead, not to beg them to save the child. It wasn't proof in itself, but it was a crack in the facade. Throughout it all, Shane sat at the defense table, his face carefully composed. To the jury, he looked like a man enduring indignities, listening as strangers dissected the worst night of his life. His attorneys wanted that stoicism to read as strength, as dignity under fire. But to Annette, who sat behind him, the posture was familiar in another way. It was the same composure he had shown when Renee died, the calm that now seemed less like grief and more like indifference. And in that moment, she realized the trial wasn't only about convincing 12 jurors. It was about convincing herself, finally, that the man she once loved was capable of killing their daughter. If the medical examiner gave the jury science, Renee Goode gave them history. When she walked to the stand, she carried herself with quiet gravity. Years had passed since her marriage to Shane, but the memories were still raw, etched deep into her voice. She swore the oath, took her seat, and met the prosecutor's eyes with a look that said she had waited a long time for this moment. The courtroom grew still as Jerry Yen began her questioning. "Kay, can you tell the jury about your marriage to the defendant?" What followed was not the story of a loving partnership, but a slow descent into fear. Kay described Shane's charm at the beginning, the gifts, the compliments, the easy confidence that drew her in. Then she told of how quickly that charm curdled into control. "He had to have the last word," she explained. "He had to control what I wore, who I spoke to, where I went. If I questioned him, even a little, he would snap." Her voice faltered as she recounted nights when his temper turned physical. The slaps, the shoves, the times she locked herself in a room to escape his rage. The jury listened in silence, their eyes shifting between Kay and the man sitting at the defense table. Shane sat motionless, jaw tight, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The defense objected, claiming her testimony was prejudicial, not directly tied to Renee's death. But Yen countered that it established a pattern, a portrait of a man whose need for control was not confined to one relationship or one moment in time. The judge agreed, and Kay continued. "He could be cruel without laying a hand on me," she said softly. "It was in the way he mocked me, the way he laughed when I cried. He wanted me to feel small, and I did." Then came the most chilling moment of her testimony. She described an argument years before Renee's death, when Shane had cornered her in their home. His face was inches from hers. His hands were clenched, and he said words she never forgot. "I could make you disappear, and no one would ever know." Gasps rippled faintly through the courtroom. On cross-examination, the defense tried to dismantle her credibility. They asked whether she was bitter, whether she resented Shane for the failure of their marriage. They pointed out that she had never filed police reports, never pressed charges, never sought restraining orders. Kay held steady. "I was scared," she answered simply. "And he knew it. That was enough to keep me quiet then. But it's not enough to keep me quiet now." Her words hung in the air like a verdict of their own. For Sharon, listening from the gallery, Kay's testimony was both horrifying and affirming. She had suspected Shane's darkness, but hearing it laid out so plainly made her feel less alone. For Annette, it was even harder. She had lived with Shane, too, and recognized the same manipulations in her own marriage. The words he had used on Kay were echoes of the ones he had used on her. It was as if a mask she had once thought unique to her had been mass-produced, worn by Shane with every woman who crossed his path. By the time Kay stepped down, the jurors had not just the medical evidence of Renee's death, but a portrait of the man accused of causing it. Controlling, violent, capable of cruelty. The picture was growing sharper, and the prosecution was only just beginning. The next witness was the one who carried the most emotional weight. Sharon had been waiting for this moment for years. She had buried her granddaughter, fought through silence and disbelief, pushed against the machinery of denial and indifference. Now she stood in front of the jury, sworn in, ready to speak for Renee one last time. Her voice trembled at first, but not from fear, from the immensity of the moment. She told the jury about Renee's short life, her laughter, her gentleness, her innocence. She spoke of birthdays and bedtime stories, of the way Renee's hair curled at the ends, of the sweetness that filled a house whenever she was near. And then her voice hardened as she described the night Renee died. The phone call, the numbness, the ache of a truth she recognized even before anyone spoke it aloud. "I knew," she told the jurors, her voice breaking. "I knew in my bones. Mothers know, and grandmothers know too. He killed her, and I wasn't going to let her be forgotten." The courtroom was silent except for the faint sound of muffled tears in the gallery. Even some jurors wiped their eyes, caught in the rawness of Sharon's grief. The defense tried carefully to undermine her testimony. They suggested she had never liked Shane, that she had resented him from the beginning, that her accusations were born not from evidence but from dislike. Sharon didn't flinch. She admitted she had distrusted him early on. She admitted she had disliked his arrogance, his cruelty, the way he belittled Annette. "But I didn't decide he killed my granddaughter because I disliked him," she said, steady now, her eyes locked on the defense attorney. "I decided it because I knew her and I knew him, and I knew what he was capable of." Her words landed heavier than any forensic report. With Sharon's testimony, the prosecution's case began to knit itself together. The jury had heard from science, from Shane's past, and now from the heart of the family itself. Together, the threads wove a single picture. A man who controlled, manipulated, and, when cornered, destroyed. Annette watched it all from the gallery, her own emotions pulled in every direction. Her mother's words echoed her own fears, her own realizations. And yet, seeing Shane sitting there, stone-faced, she felt the tug of years of loyalty, of love that had once been real. It was a torment few could understand, to grieve both a child and the father of that child at the same time. But even as the trial weighed on her, Annette began to see something she hadn't before. That this trial wasn't just about Renee. It was about her too. About her survival, her voice, her chance to break free of the man who had taken so much from them all. By the end of the first week of testimony, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. What began as a case some feared might falter on circumstantial evidence now carried undeniable momentum. The jurors were listening. They were leaning in. And Shane, still seated in his stiff posture, still wearing the mask of ordinary dignity, looked smaller than he ever had. Not physically, but in presence. For the first time, it seemed possible that his masks would not hold, that the truth would finally reach him, even here, in the place he had believed he could control with charm and composure. The trial was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. When Annette Goode was called to the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. This was not just another witness. This was Renee's mother. This was Shane's wife. She was the one person who had lived at the crossroads of love and suspicion, grief and denial, and her words could carry more weight than any forensic expert. She walked slowly, shoulders hunched as though bracing against a storm. Taking the oath, she avoided Shane's eyes. For years, she had orbited him, bound by love, fear, habit, and hope. Now she sat under oath, facing 12 strangers who needed to know whether she believed the man beside her had killed their child. The prosecutor began gently. Questions about Renee, her birth, her smile, her laugh. Annette's voice wavered, but she spoke of her daughter with a tenderness that filled the silent room. Then the questioning shifted. Her marriage, Shane's temper, his need for control. Slowly, carefully, the prosecutor peeled back the layers. Annette admitted Shane could be harsh, that he belittled her, that he had frightened her at times. Her words came hesitantly, as though each admission cost her a piece of herself. But she said them, and with each one, the portrait of Shane darkened. Finally, the prosecutor asked, "Annette, do you believe your husband was responsible for Renee's death?" The silence was suffocating. Annette's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at her hands, twisted in her lap. Her lips trembled, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, "Yes, I believe he did." The words seemed to hang in the air, shocking in their simplicity. Sharon gasped softly, tears spilling down her face. Even the jurors, trained to keep neutral expressions, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the moment. The defense leapt into cross-examination, knowing how damaging Annette's testimony could be. They pressed her relentlessly. Hadn't she stayed with Shane after Renee's death? Hadn't she once defended him to police? Hadn't she told friends he could never hurt their daughter? "Yes," Annette admitted to each, "because I wanted to believe it, because I loved him, because I couldn't face the truth." The defense tried to paint her as confused, manipulated by her mother, pushed into believing something she didn't truly believe. They suggested grief had clouded her judgment, that Sue Dietrich had fed her doubts, that Sharon's hostility toward Shane had poisoned her perspective. Annette's composure cracked under the onslaught. Tears streamed down her face. At one point, she sobbed openly, forcing the judge to call a short recess. When she returned, she was steadier. And when the defense asked once more if she was sure about her belief, she looked directly at Shane for the first time since taking the stand. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice breaking but strong. "I am sure." That moment reverberated like a thunderclap. For the jury, it was a window into the private world of the Goodes, into the battle between loyalty and survival, between love and truth. Annette was not a perfect witness. She faltered, contradicted herself, and cried. But her rawness was its own kind of authenticity. She wasn't rehearsed. She wasn't polished. She was a mother who had lived inside a nightmare and was only now finding the courage to name it. For Shane, it was perhaps the first time he looked rattled. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched beneath the table. He didn't look at Annette. He stared at the floor, as if the gaze of his own wife, his former ally, was too much to endure. By the time Annette stepped down, the trial had shifted. The medical examiner had given science. Kay had given history. Sharon had given conviction. And now Annette had given the jury a glimpse of the deepest, most personal cost of Shane's control. The prosecution's story was taking shape with painful clarity. Shane Goode was not a man caught in tragedy. He was a man who created it. After days of prosecution witnesses, the defense finally stood ready to present its case. For Shane, it was the moment he had been waiting for. The chance to shed the image of a cold, controlling killer and step back into the role of the misunderstood father. His attorneys began by reminding the jury of a principle that underpinned the entire trial: innocent until proven guilty. They stressed that circumstantial evidence was just that, circumstantial. They emphasized that no one had seen Shane hurt Renee. No one had witnessed a crime. The prosecution's story, they argued, was stitched together from bitterness, grief, and assumptions. To drive the point home, they called a series of character witnesses. Neighbors described Shane as polite, hardworking, the man who delivered their mail with a friendly wave. Co-workers from the National Guard spoke of his discipline and camaraderie. A family friend testified that he had seemed heartbroken after Renee's death, quiet and withdrawn in a way that seemed wholly consistent with grief. Each witness painted a portrait of normalcy, of a man who looked nothing like the monster described by the prosecution. The defense also worked to dismantle the credibility of Sharon and Kay. They suggested Sharon had resented Shane from the start, that she had never thought he was good enough for Annette, and that her suspicion of him was rooted in personal dislike, not evidence. They implied Kay was bitter over their failed marriage, that her stories of abuse were exaggerated or even invented to punish him. For Annette, they argued she was fragile, grieving, and easily influenced by her strong-willed mother. They suggested that in her heart, she didn't truly believe Shane killed Renee, but that she had been pressured into saying so. Their narrative was clear. Shane was not a killer, but the target of a family vendetta. Then came the moment everyone anticipated, Shane himself taking the stand. He walked to the witness box with measured steps, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt, his hair combed with precision. Sworn in, he sat upright, hands folded, his face calm. The defense began softly, guiding him through his life story, his upbringing, his service in the Guard, his work as a postal carrier. He spoke of his pride in those roles, his sense of responsibility, his identity as a provider. Then came Renee. His voice cracked slightly as he described her birth, her first steps, her laugh. He said he adored her, that she was the center of his life. When asked about the night she died, he delivered the story he had told from the beginning. He had put her to bed, she seemed fine, and in the morning she was gone. He insisted he had panicked, but that his calm exterior was simply his way of coping. "Not everyone screams and cries," he told the jury. "I shut down. That's how I handle pain." The defense framed him as stoic, misunderstood, a man whose dignity and grief had been twisted into evidence against him. But the real test came under cross-examination. The prosecutor approached slowly, papers in hand, eyes fixed on Shane. The questions began with small details, his timeline, his actions, his words to paramedics. Then they grew sharper. "Mr. Goode, can you explain why multiple witnesses described you as detached, even cold, on the night your daughter died?" "I was in shock," Shane replied evenly. "Can you explain why your ex-wife testified about years of abuse? Why your wife described being belittled and controlled? Why your mother-in-law saw fear in her daughter's eyes?" "They're exaggerating," he said. "They never liked me. They've been against me from the start." The prosecutor leaned closer. "So everyone else is lying, your ex-wife, your mother-in-law, even the detective who pursued this case for years? And you alone are telling the truth?" Shane's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said flatly. "I am telling the truth." The exchange crackled with tension. For jurors, it was a stark contrast. The calm, controlled Shane, insisting he was misunderstood, versus the accumulation of voices describing him as manipulative, abusive, and capable of harm. In the gallery, Sharon watched with a mixture of rage and grim satisfaction. She had seen this performance before: the polished mask, the refusal to admit fault, the quiet insistence that everyone else was wrong. To her, it wasn't convincing. It was confirmation. Annette, however, felt the old pull of his charisma. Even now, even after everything, there was something familiar in his tone, something that reminded her of the man she had once loved. But then she remembered her daughter, remembered the silence of that terrible morning, remembered the way his indifference had chilled her to the core. The conflict tore at her, but for the first time, she recognized it for what it was: manipulation dressed up as love. When Shane stepped down from the stand, the courtroom was left with two competing narratives: a grieving father wrongfully accused, or a calculating man whose control finally turned fatal. The defense had done its best to humanize him, to poke holes in the prosecution's case. But whether it was enough to overcome the weight of testimony from Sharon, Kay, Annette, and the medical examiner, that was a question only the jury could answer. By the close of the defense's case, the courtroom felt different. The prosecution had told a story of control and cruelty. The defense had told one of misunderstanding and vendetta. Now, with closing arguments on the horizon, the trial was moving toward its climax, the point at which 12 ordinary people would decide which story they believed. The final phase of the trial began with a hush. Everyone in the courtroom understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Weeks of testimony, years of grief and suspicion, decades of lies and truths were about to be distilled into words spoken directly to the jury. The prosecution went first. Jerry Yen rose, her notes neatly stacked, her voice steady but resonant. She reminded the jurors of the medical examiner's findings, of the petechiae in Renee's eyes, of the suffocation that could not be explained away. She reminded them of Kay's testimony, of the violence and threats that revealed who Shane really was when the mask slipped. She reminded them of Sharon's unwavering certainty, and Annette's courage in admitting the most painful truth of her life. "This case," she said, "is not built on one witness or one moment. It is built on a pattern, a picture that emerges when you place all the pieces together. And when you see that picture clearly, there is only one conclusion: Shane Goode murdered his daughter." Her voice sharpened, her words slicing through the silence. "This is not about vengeance. It is about justice. It is about a little girl whose voice was stolen, whose life was cut short. And today you have the power to speak for her." She ended by pointing at the empty chair where Renee should have been, a subtle but devastating reminder of the absence at the heart of the case. The defense countered with equal passion. They framed the prosecution's case as a house of cards built on suspicion and bitterness. They argued that no direct evidence existed, that no one had seen Shane commit a crime, that grief had warped the memories and motives of the key witnesses. They painted Sharon as a mother-in-law who had despised Shane from the beginning, Kay as a scorned ex-wife seeking revenge, Annette as a fragile woman swayed by the pressure of others. And Shane? He was a grieving father, they said, a man who had endured the unimaginable, only to be accused of the unthinkable. "Don't let sympathy for tragedy blind you to the truth," they urged the jurors. "Don't let suspicion replace proof." They ended with a warning. "If you convict on this evidence, you convict not on certainty, but on possibility." and possibility is not enough. The judge's instructions were long and meticulous, laying out the burden of proof, the meaning of reasonable doubt, the responsibilities of jurors. Then the jury filed out, the heavy door shutting behind them. What followed was a limbo that stretched across hours, then days. Inside the deliberation room, 12 people wrestled with the weight of their task. Some jurors leaned immediately toward guilt, citing the autopsy, the testimony, the patterns of abuse. Others hesitated, wary of convicting without direct evidence, worried about the enormity of sentencing a man for his daughter's murder on circumstantial grounds. The discussions grew heated at times. Jurors replayed testimony, reread transcripts, argued over the meaning of reasonable doubt. Slowly, painfully, a consensus began to emerge. Back in the courtroom, Sharon prayed silently, hands clenched. Annette sat rigid, staring at the empty jury box, her heart caught between dread and relief. Shane remained impassive, though his fingers tapped lightly against the table, a tiny crack in his facade of calm. On the third day, the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict. The air grew electric, every eye fixed on the door as the jurors filed back in, their faces solemn, unreadable. The foreman handed the slip of paper to the judge. The judge scanned it, then returned it. The clerk rose, voice steady, and read aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Shane Goode, guilty of murder." Gasps and sobs filled the room. Sharon wept openly, tears streaming as she clutched the memory of her granddaughter. Annette broke down too, her grief colliding with the faint, fragile relief of justice at last. Sue sat quietly, her eyes closed, her breath shuddering out in release after years of relentless pursuit. Shane did not move. He sat frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. For the first time, the mask had no purpose. The sentencing phase was swift. The jury, having convicted, now weighed punishment. They heard of Shane's history, of his temper, of the lives he had scarred. The prosecution asked for the maximum penalty. The defense begged for mercy. When the decision came, it was final, a life sentence. Shane Goode was led away in handcuffs, no longer the master of his narrative, no longer the center of control. Just another inmate, swallowed by the system he had once believed he could outmaneuver. For Sharon, for Annette, for Kay, and for Sue, the verdict was not victory. Could never be. Renee was still gone, her laugh silenced, her future erased. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was the world finally agreeing with what they had always known. That Renee's death was not chance, not fate, but murder. And in that acknowledgement lay a measure of peace. The trial was over, the gavel had fallen, and Shane Goode was gone from the courthouse in shackles. For the first time in years, the women who had fought for Renee could breathe without the constant weight of waiting. Yet freedom from suspense did not bring freedom from pain. Sharon sat in her quiet house and realized that silence had a different weight now. It was not the silence of dread, waiting for the next hearing, the next delay, the next appeal. It was the silence of finality, of knowing Renee's killer had been named. But it was also the silence of absence, the little girl who would never run through her hallways, never climb into her lap again. Justice, she realized, was not a cure. It was a bandage over a wound that would never fully close. She found solace in small rituals, visiting Renee's grave, telling stories about her to anyone who would listen, keeping her memory alive so that the girl who had been silenced too soon would never be forgotten. For Annette, the days after the verdict were both liberating and shattering. She was free of the constant torment of doubt, free of the man who had controlled her life for so long. But she was also left to reckon with herself, with the years she had stayed by his side, with the blindness she had clung to, with the guilt that gnawed at her heart. Some nights she woke in a sweat, hearing echoes of his voice, remembering the way he could twist her thoughts until she doubted her own instincts. The abuse hadn't ended with his arrest. It lived inside her still, woven into her memory, replaying in the quiet hours of the night. But therapy, faith, and the steady presence of her mother gave her a foothold. Slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild her sense of self. She spoke openly about abuse, about the ways manipulation can imprison even the strongest hearts. And in those moments of honesty, she found not just healing for herself, but for others who recognized their own stories in hers. Sue Dietrich, the detective who had refused to let go, also carried scars from the case. For years she had pushed against doubt, bureaucracy, and resistance, insisting there was truth hidden beneath the surface. The guilty verdict validated her persistence, but it also reminded her of the limits of justice. Renee was still gone. Her job was to solve cases, but no verdict could restore what had been stolen. She turned her energy to training younger detectives, teaching them the lessons she had learned the hard way. Listen to the mothers, follow the patterns, and never dismiss instinct when it is backed by evidence. Renee's case became part of her legacy, a story she told not with pride but with purpose. And then there was Shane. Prison stripped him of the illusions he had cultivated for years. Inside those walls, there was no audience for his charm, no neighbors to impress, no family to manipulate. His identity as a father, husband, soldier, and mail carrier was gone. In its place was a number, a cell, a daily routine dictated by others. For a man who had built his life on control, it was the deepest punishment imaginable. Yet even there, Shane sought to project an image. Some inmates saw him as quiet, disciplined, almost aloof. He read, he kept to himself, he avoided fights. But others saw through it, the flashes of arrogance, the coldness in his eyes. He filed appeals, of course. He claimed the trial had been unfair, that the evidence was too thin, that he was the victim of lies. But each attempt failed, and each rejection chipped away at the hope he clung to. Behind bars, his world narrowed to the size of his cell. And as the years stretched on, the man who once demanded control over every room he entered became just another figure lost in the machinery of the prison system. Outside those walls, Renee's memory continued to grow, carried by the women who had fought for her. Sharon became an advocate for victims' families, speaking at events, urging others not to give up when justice seemed impossible. Annette found her own voice, too, learning that survival was not weakness but strength. Kay, free of Shane's shadow, raised her children with a determination that they would never know the fear she had once lived under. Together, their lives testified to a truth larger than the verdict, that even in the face of loss and cruelty, resilience was possible, that love, though battered, could endure. The story of Renee Goode's murder did not end with the slam of a gavel. It lived on in the memories of those who loved her, in the warnings passed to others, in the quiet strength of women who had refused to be silenced. And in that persistence, in that refusal to forget, lay the truest form of justice. The years after the verdict stretched into a different kind of waiting. For Sharon, Annette, Sue, and Kay, the fight inside the courtroom was finished, but the echoes of that battle followed them into daily life. Justice had been won, but justice did not mean forgetting. In the first months, there were still hearings, sentencing confirmations, post-trial motions, the slow grind of paperwork that seemed to stretch the shadow of the trial just a little longer. Then came the inevitable appeals. Shane's attorneys argued that the evidence had been circumstantial, that the jury had been swayed by emotion rather than proof, that his constitutional rights had been violated. They filed, waited, and lost, again and again. Each denial was a relief, but also a reminder that Shane's presence was not entirely gone. His name surfaced in legal documents, his case number popped up in court dockets, his shadow lingered in news articles that revisited the tragedy every time a filing was rejected. Prison changed Shane, but it did not reform him. Reports trickled back through the grapevine of his behavior behind bars. Some said he kept to himself, that he was the quiet inmate who didn't cause trouble. Others described him as manipulative even there, trying to cultivate sympathy among fellow prisoners or staff. But what became clear was this. The charm that once carried him through life had no currency in a place where everyone wore the same uniform and everyone lived under the same rules. He was no longer special. He was no longer feared. He was simply another man serving out a life sentence, waiting for appeals that would never come. For a man like Shane, obscurity was its own punishment. Meanwhile, life outside those walls moved forward, though never without scars. Sharon became a voice in her community for victims' families. She attended vigils, spoke at gatherings, and wrote letters to newly grieving parents who faced the same despair she once had. She did not claim to have answers, but she knew the power of being heard. "Don't give up," she told them. "The system is slow, but persistence matters. Your child's voice matters." Her words carried weight not because they were polished, but because they were lived. Annette's journey was slower, harder. She had to disentangle herself from years of control, years of believing Shane's version of reality. Therapy became a lifeline. At first, she resisted, reluctant to peel back the layers of guilt and shame. But slowly, she began to see the patterns for what they were: manipulation, abuse, gaslighting. She learned to forgive herself, though it took time. Forgiveness did not mean excusing. It meant recognizing that survival in the shadow of an abuser often looks like compliance, and that compliance does not erase courage. Kay's healing came in the form of fiercely protecting her children. She raised them with honesty, refusing to let silence become an inheritance. They knew their father was in prison, and they knew why. She chose openness over secrets, determined that the cycles of fear and manipulation would stop with her. For Sue, Renee's case became a lesson she carried into every corner of her work. She trained new detectives to trust persistence, to listen closely, to avoid dismissing cases that seemed too thin at first glance. She reminded them that behind every file was a family who would not forget. Her colleagues noticed that she spoke of Renee often, not to relive the pain, but to pass on the determination. In her words, Renee's short life became a teacher to others. Over the years, Renee's name began to appear in places beyond the courtroom. Articles revisited her story. Documentaries highlighted the persistence of women like Sharon and Sue, and advocates for victims used her case as an example of why persistence matters. She became more than a victim. She became a symbol of the strength of voices that refused to be silenced. But anniversaries still hurt. Each year when Renee's birthday came, Sharon lit a candle and placed it by a framed photograph. Annette visited the grave, sometimes with flowers, sometimes just with silence. Kay did the same, bringing her children so they would know the sister they lost too soon. They did not move on, but they moved forward, carrying Renee with them always. Shane remained in prison year after year, a man diminished by time. His once sharp features softened, his hair thinned, his name faded from headlines. He became what he had never wanted to be, ordinary. And for the women whose lives he had sought to dominate, that ordinariness was the closest thing to peace they could imagine. In the years after the verdict, Sharon often said that grief was like learning to walk with a limp. You didn't get over it. You adjusted, you learned new rhythms, you found ways to move forward even when the ache never truly left. Her limp was Renee. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone missed was a reminder of what had been stolen. But she refused to let grief consume her completely. She had lived long enough to know that sorrow could either shrink your world or widen it. She chose to widen hers. She became a familiar face in support groups, the woman who always carried tissues in her purse, who listened as much as she spoke. Younger mothers and grandmothers gravitated to her, sensing the steel beneath her gentleness. If she can survive, they thought, maybe I can too. It wasn't easy. There were days Sharon wanted to close the blinds and sink into silence. But she reminded herself that Renee had been light, laughter, joy. To live only in darkness felt like betraying that memory. So she laughed when she could, and she let herself cry when she couldn't. Both, she learned, were forms of love. For Annette, survival looked different. She had spent years as Shane's wife, her identity intertwined with his, her sense of worth distorted by his control. After his conviction, she had to ask questions she'd never allowed herself before. Who was she outside of him? What did she want? Who could she be when fear no longer dictated her every step? At first, she felt unmoored. Decisions paralyzed her. Even simple choices, what to wear, where to eat, were tinged with doubt. Shane had trained her to second-guess herself, to believe she was incapable on her own. Undoing that conditioning was a slow, painful process. Therapy gave her tools, but it was daily practice that reshaped her. She learned to trust small instincts. She learned that mistakes weren't disasters but part of growth. She learned that independence was not loneliness, but freedom. And, perhaps most importantly, she learned to speak her truth without apology. When she shared her story, whether in small groups, in therapy sessions, or eventually in public talks, she discovered that her voice carried weight. Other women nodded as she spoke, tears in their eyes, recognizing themselves in her descriptions of subtle control, quiet fear, invisible wounds. In helping them name their realities, Annette was finally reclaiming her own. Mother and daughter leaned on each other in ways they hadn't before. Sharon provided steadiness when Annette wavered. Annette provided companionship when Sharon's house felt too quiet. Their relationship was not without tension. The wounds of the past sometimes reopened, but they had been forged in fire, and fire had made them stronger. Sharon stopped seeing herself solely as the grandmother who lost her granddaughter. She was also a mother who had stood by her daughter, even when it meant facing unbearable truths. And Annette stopped seeing herself only as the woman who had loved a killer. She was also the mother who had survived, who had chosen truth when it mattered most. In their own ways, both found that Renee was not just a loss but a legacy. Her short life had forced them to confront lies, to challenge power, to demand justice. That legacy lived on not just in their grief, but in their growth. Sharon's advocacy helped other families find their voices. Annette's honesty helped other women break free from silence. And together, they honored Renee by ensuring her story did not vanish into the quiet statistics of tragedy. Meanwhile, Shane remained behind bars, the man at the center of their lives reduced to the background of it. His name still surfaced occasionally, in denied appeals in prison records, but he no longer dictated their days. Annette once told her therapist that this was the greatest victory. He doesn't control me anymore. Not in life. Not in memory. Not in love. It had taken years, but it was true. For Detective Sue Dietrich, the years after Shane Goode's conviction were marked by a strange blend of closure and haunting. She had been the one to keep pushing when others let the file gather dust. She had been the one to sit across from Sharon and Annette, to tell them that persistence mattered, to promise that she would not stop until the truth came out. And she had kept that promise. But detectives live with ghosts. Some are the unsolved cases, the ones that slip through the cracks. Others are the ones they solve, but at a cost that still feels unbearable. Renee was one of those ghosts. Sue poured herself into her work with renewed purpose. She began mentoring younger detectives, teaching them the art of patience, the necessity of compassion. Evidence matters, she would say, but never forget the people behind the evidence. If you don't listen to them, you'll miss what really matters. She spoke often of Renee not in gruesome detail but in principle. That case taught me that persistence saves lives. That victims' families know more than we sometimes give them credit for. That justice isn't about speed, it's about endurance. Her reputation grew not just as a detective but as a mentor. She was the kind of officer who humanized the badge, who believed justice was not only a process but a duty of empathy. Renee's story, tragic as it was, became a guidepost in her career. But in the quiet moments, when Sue was alone with her thoughts, she admitted something to herself. She wished she could have saved Renee while she was alive. That was the weight she would carry forever. For Kay, the years unfolded in the rhythm of motherhood. Raising her children in the shadow of their father's conviction was never simple. They were old enough to ask questions, and she had made a promise to herself that she would not hide the truth. She told them the story in pieces, careful not to overwhelm them too young, but honest enough that they would understand. Your father made choices, she explained. Choices that hurt people, choices that can't be undone. But you are not him. His mistakes do not define you. It was a mantra she repeated often. You are not him. Her children grew up with the knowledge that their father was in prison. At first, they struggled with shame. Schoolmates whispered. Neighbors speculated. The shadow of his name lingered. But Kay taught them resilience. She taught them that identity is built not on blood, but on actions. Her own healing was tied to theirs. Every time her children laughed, every time they achieved something he could never take from them, she felt another chain loosen around her heart. Still, there were moments of bitterness. Nights when she lay awake wondering how different life might have been if she had left earlier, if she had seen the danger sooner, if she had found a way to protect Renee. Guilt, even misplaced, is a stubborn companion. But in those moments, she reminded herself of what Sharon often said. Guilt keeps us frozen. Love keeps us moving. And so she moved, always forward, for the sake of her children. In time, both Sue and Kay found themselves connected in ways they hadn't expected. Though their roles in Renee's life had been very different, one a detective, the other an ex-wife, the case had bound them together in a circle of survival. At memorials, they sometimes stood side by side. Sue with her quiet strength, Kay with her protective fierceness. Two women who had stared down Shane Goode's shadow and refused to let it define them. Their stories were not about forgetting, but about carrying. Carrying Renee's memory. Carrying the lessons learned in the hardest way possible. Carrying the proof that even in the aftermath of tragedy, life could still hold meaning. For Sue, that meaning was in guiding others. For Kay, it was in raising her children free of fear. Both, in their own ways, ensured that Renee's short life would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Time had passed, measured not by court dates or hearings anymore, but by birthdays missed, holidays altered, and anniversaries honored. For the first time in decades, life for Sharon, Annette, Sue, and Kay was not defined by waiting for a verdict or preparing for trial. Yet Renee's presence remained the constant cord that bound them all. It was Sharon who first suggested they gather on what would have been Renee's 18th birthday. She deserves to be remembered, she told Annette quietly, her voice soft but firm. Not just in grief, but in love. Annette hesitated. 18 was a milestone, graduations, new beginnings, the cusp of adulthood. Imagining her daughter at that age was almost unbearable. But the idea of marking the day together, with the women who had carried Renee's memory so fiercely, felt right. They met at the cemetery that afternoon, each bringing something of Renee's. Sharon brought a small bouquet of lilies, Annette a framed photo of Renee as a toddler, Kay a bracelet she had once bought for her daughter but never had the chance to give, and Sue a handwritten note folded neatly into an envelope. The four women stood together, the late summer sun casting long shadows across the grass. At first, there was silence. Awkward, heavy, the kind that comes when grief collides with gratitude. Then Sharon spoke. She would have been starting college this year, she said, her eyes glistening. Maybe studying nursing. She always had a gentle touch. Annette's breath caught. Or maybe art, she whispered. She loved coloring, remember? She could spend hours just filling pages. Kay smiled faintly. She had my stubborn streak. Whatever she wanted, she would have chased it. Sue unfolded her note and read aloud, her detective's voice softened by emotion. Renee, I never knew you the way they did, but I carried you with me for years. Every time I felt like giving up, I thought of you. You made me a better detective and a better person. Your life mattered. It still does. Tears fell freely then, not just for the child they had lost, but for the ways she had shaped their lives. Afterward, they sat together at a nearby diner, sharing coffee and pie. It felt almost ordinary for women talking around a table. But beneath the small talk, there was a profound sense of connection. They spoke of survival, not just their own, but the survival of memory, of resilience, of love in the face of cruelty. They shared the ways they had carried on. Sharon with her advocacy, Annette with her speaking, Sue with her mentorship, Kay with her children. You know, Sue said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, justice is never really finished. It's not a verdict or a sentence. It's what you do afterward. It's how you live. The others nodded. Each of them had found their own version of justice, not in the courtroom, but in the choices they made every day. That gathering became a tradition. Each year on Renee's birthday they met, sometimes at the cemetery, sometimes in Sharon's living room, sometimes over dinner. They brought stories, photos, little tokens. Over time, the ritual transformed from mourning into something more: celebration. They laughed as often as they cried, imagining what Renee might have been like at 20, 25, 30. They wondered about her career, her friendships, whether she would have married, had children of her own. In giving her an imagined future, they kept her alive in their hearts. For Sharon, these gatherings affirmed that Renee's life was not forgotten. For Annette, they were a reminder that she was not alone. For Kay, they gave her children a sense of belonging in a wider circle of resilience. For Sue, they were proof that her work had meaning beyond the case file. For women, bound by tragedy, reshaped that bond into something stronger than grief: community. And in that community, Renee's legacy endured, not only as a victim, but as the reason these women chose to fight, to heal, to speak, to live. Renee's name was once only known in the whispered conversations of family, the urgent pleas of a grandmother, and the stubborn notes of a detective's case file. But in the years that followed Sharon Goode's conviction, her story began to ripple outward, reaching people who had never met her, people who would carry her memory as a call to awareness. It began with local reporters. The case had been covered in the press at the time of the trial, of course, headlines that read "Father convicted in child's death" or "Justice for Renee." But journalists returned to the story in later years, particularly as anniversaries passed or appeals were denied. Sharon was often the one they sought out. She didn't relish the attention, but she knew it mattered. If her story helps just one person see the signs earlier, if it helps one woman trust her instincts, then it's worth it, she explained more than once. Her interviews carried the quiet power of authenticity. She didn't dramatize. She simply spoke the truth. Annette, too, found herself asked to share her perspective. At first, she resisted. The thought of her life becoming public, of her mistakes dissected by strangers, was terrifying. But over time, she realized that silence served Shane's kind of power, while openness dismantled it. She began speaking at small events, church gatherings, domestic violence awareness workshops, support groups for families who had lost children. Her story wasn't polished. She stumbled, she cried, she sometimes went off script. But audiences listened because she was real, and real stories cut through statistics in ways numbers never could. The broader community also began to adopt Renee's memory as a symbol. Domestic violence advocates cited the case when pushing for better training for law enforcement officers, arguing that subtle signs of abuse should never be dismissed. Victim support organizations used Renee's story in campaigns, reminding the public that abuse often hides in plain sight and that children are often the silent casualties. Sue Dietrich contributed, too. Retired from active duty but still deeply respected, she gave lectures at law enforcement conferences, emphasizing the importance of persistence. Justice isn't about neat files or perfect evidence, she told young detectives. It's about digging until you find the truth. Renee's case taught me that no detail is too small, and no family member's voice should be ignored. Her words resonated. Detectives who had never heard of Renee Goode carried her name back to their departments, repeating the lessons they had learned. In that way, Renee's story traveled far beyond the county where she lived and died. Media interest grew again when a true crime documentary producer approached Sharon and Annette about telling the story on film. At first, both hesitated. They feared exploitation, feared seeing their pain turned into entertainment. But after careful conversations, they agreed on one condition: that the focus remain on Renee and on the women who fought for justice, not on the sensational details of Shane's life. The documentary, when it aired, was raw and unpolished, but it struck a chord. Viewers reached out with letters and emails, some sharing their own experiences of abuse, others thanking the family for their courage. For Sharon, the most meaningful messages came from strangers who wrote, "Because of Renee's story, I left my abusive partner," or "Your fight gave me the strength to speak up." That was the ripple effect. One small life cut tragically short was changing others. Kay's children grew up in that ripple, too. They watched their mother participate in advocacy events, saw their grandmother speak with reporters, listened to their aunt share painful truths. It shaped them, instilling in them a sense of resilience and responsibility. One of them once told a teacher, "My dad made bad choices, but my family taught me we don't have to repeat them." That kind of clarity, born of pain, was its own form of justice. In time, Renee's story became not just a family's tragedy, but a community's cautionary tale, a call to vigilance, and a testament to resilience. She had been silenced as a child, but through the voices of those who loved her, she continued to speak. Prison had always been a cage, but in Shane's early years behind bars, he had clung to the belief that it was temporary. Appeals, he told himself, would overturn the verdict. New lawyers would uncover flaws in the trial. Someone, somewhere, would see that he had been wronged. That illusion gave him purpose. He drafted letters, filed motions, badgered attorneys who eventually stopped returning his calls. Each rejection stung, but he replaced despair with defiance. "I'll get out," he told anyone who would listen. "They can't keep me here forever." But time has a way of breaking down even the most stubborn lies. By the second decade of his sentence, Shane was no longer the sharp-faced man in the courtroom, pressing his lips into a thin smile as the jury filed in. His hair had thinned to gray, his body softened with age, his once straight posture bent under the weight of years. The bravado was still there in flashes, but it no longer fooled anyone. Inside prison, arrogance carried no currency. Charm didn't matter. Control didn't matter. Every man wore the same uniform. Every man followed the same schedule. Every man lived by rules not of his making. For someone like Shane, who had spent his life bending others to his will, the loss of control was its own slow death. He tried to carve out small spheres of influence. He befriended certain inmates, attempted to align himself with those who might see him as a leader. But the reality was harsher. Most saw through him quickly. They recognized the coldness in his eyes, the manipulative streak in his words. Some kept their distance. Others mocked him outright. The charm that had once carried him through jobs, relationships, and neighborhoods had no audience here. Inmates respected toughness, not smug superiority. Guards valued compliance, not posturing. Shane fit neither mold. As the years wore on, his circle of influence shrank. He became just another aging inmate, one of the many men who shuffled through the cafeteria line, who kept his head down during yard time, who filled the hours with reading and restless pacing. The appeals stopped eventually, not because Shane had accepted guilt, but because the legal system had run its course. Every avenue had been exhausted. He was out of options. The realization hit him quietly, without ceremony, on an ordinary day. A letter arrived. Appeal denied. He sat on his bunk, staring at the words, the finality sinking in. There would be no courtroom redemption, no dramatic reversal, no chance to rewrite the story. For a man who had built his life on control, on the belief that he could outsmart anyone, the silence that followed was unbearable. Prison aged him quickly. His body grew frail, his health declined. Medical visits became routine, pills replaced bravado. The younger inmates looked past him, barely acknowledging his presence. He was no longer a figure to be noticed. He was simply old, and that, more than the sentence, more than the walls, more than the loss of freedom, was the punishment he had never imagined. Obscurity. For years, Shane had thrived on being the center of a story. Whether as the charming soldier, the helpful mail carrier, the manipulative husband, or even the accused man in the courtroom, he had always commanded attention. Now he was invisible, forgotten. Outside those walls, the world moved on. Sharon continued her advocacy. Annette rebuilt her life. Kay raised her children. Sue mentored a new generation. Renee's name lived on in community programs and awareness campaigns. But Shane's name faded. No headlines, no visitors, no legacy. Just a number in the prison system. It was the one fate he could never control, to be forgotten. The years softened the edges of grief, though they never erased it. For Sharon, life in her later years was quieter, but not empty. Her house, once filled with the laughter of children and the chaos of family gatherings, had grown still. Yet she carried a sense of purpose that kept her moving, even when her body slowed. Every morning, she lit a candle by Renee's photograph. Some days she spoke aloud to her granddaughter. Other days she simply sat in silence, letting the flickering flame speak for her. It was her ritual, her way of reminding herself that love outlasts time. She still attended community vigils, still offered support to families navigating their own nightmares. When she spoke now, her voice was gentler, more reflective. People leaned in to listen, sensing the wisdom that only comes from decades of walking with sorrow. "You don't stop missing them," she told a room of grieving parents once, "but you learn how to carry them differently. They stop being only your pain, and they become your strength." Annette's journey was more complicated. She had lived much of her adult life in the shadow of Shane's control, then in the aftermath of his conviction. In her later years, she focused on reclaiming parts of herself that had been buried for too long. She began painting again, rediscovering the joy of color and creativity that she had once lost under Shane's watchful eye. Her small apartment filled with canvases, landscapes, portraits, bursts of abstract color. It was therapy and freedom all at once. She also continued to speak about her experiences, though now she chose her appearances carefully. She no longer felt the need to explain herself to the world. Instead, she focused on intimate settings, women's shelters, church groups, small circles where her story could be more than caution. It could be connection. Sometimes, younger women approached her afterward with tears in their eyes. "I thought it was just me," they said. Annette would shake her head gently. "It's never just you," she replied. Those words, simple but firm, carried the weight of her survival. Mother and daughter remained close. Their relationship had been tested in ways most families could never imagine. Yet in the later years, it settled into a rhythm of companionship. Sharon's wisdom grounded Annette, and Annette's creativity inspired Sharon. They often spent evenings together, sitting on Sharon's porch with cups of tea, speaking of Renee not with tears but with warm recollection. "Do you ever wonder what she'd be like now?" Annette asked one evening watching the sun set. "Every day," Sharon answered, "but I like to think she'd be proud of us." Annette smiled faintly. "She'd probably roll her eyes at how sentimental we've become." They both laughed, the sound carrying into the quiet night. For a moment, grief felt less like a weight and more like a bond. Sharon's health eventually began to decline. Hospital visits became more frequent, her steps slower. Yet even in frailty, she held firm to her rituals. The candle still burned each morning. The vigils still mattered. Renee's name was still spoken. Annette stayed by her side, determined to give her mother the same steadfast love Sharon had once given her. In those moments, she realized that survival was not just about enduring tragedy. It was about honoring the people who helped you through it. In their later years, both women reached a kind of peace. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of resilience. They had faced the worst and refused to let it define them entirely. They had chosen to live, not perfectly, not without scars, but with courage. And through their choices, Renee's legacy lived on. Kay's later years were measured not by grief alone, but by the steady rhythm of family life. Her children, once shadowed by their father's conviction, had grown into adults who charted their own courses. They carried scars, of course, how could they not? But they also carried resilience. Kay was proud of them in ways that words couldn't capture. One pursued a career in counseling, determined to help others who lived with fractured families. Another became a teacher, passionate about reaching children who, like Renee, often went unseen in their struggles. Both, in their own ways, lived out a defiance of Shane's legacy. At family gatherings, Renee's name surfaced like a touchstone. They spoke of her not only as a child who was lost, but as a thread woven into who they had become. Sometimes it was in small ways, a memory of her laughter, the stubborn tilt of her head, the way she had loved brightly colored clothes. Other times, it was in heavier moments, when anniversaries stirred pain that never fully left. Kay carried that balance, joy for the children she still had, sorrow for the one she lost, in every season of her later life. And as she aged, she found herself less haunted by questions of what if, and more focused on what now. What now? To her, meant guiding her grandchildren. It meant telling them the truth, but also showing them that truth did not have to define their futures. It meant teaching them that family is not about perfection, but about showing up, even when it's hard. She often thought of Renee in those moments, imagining her as an aunt who would have spoiled her nieces and nephews, who would have joined in the laughter around the dinner table. That imagining was bittersweet, but it kept Renee present. For Sue, retirement did not mean leaving Renee's story behind. It meant carrying it differently. In her home office, a small framed photo of Renee sat on a shelf among commendations and service awards. To visitors, it seemed like just another memento. But to Sue, it was the most important reminder that behind every case file there is a child, a mother, a family. She had spent years mentoring, lecturing, and training younger officers. In her later years, she shifted to consulting, helping departments evaluate how they handled cold cases and domestic violence reports. When asked why she still worked when she could be resting, she answered simply, "Because somewhere out there is another Renee, and someone has to keep fighting for her." Her colleagues described her as relentless but compassionate, sharp even in her later years. And though her body slowed, her mind never lost its focus on justice. Yet even Sue was not immune to reflection. In quiet evenings, she sometimes replayed the early days of the case. Those moments when it might have been easier to let it drop, when she faced pushback for pressing forward. What if I hadn't kept going? She asked herself. The answer chilled her. Shane might have walked free, and Renee's story might have been buried. That knowledge both burdened and comforted her. It reminded her that persistence matters, that one person refusing to give up can change the course of many lives. As the years wore on, Sue and Kay occasionally crossed paths. At anniversaries, community events, memorials. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond formed in the fire of tragedy and tempered by time. Sue had once been the detective seeking truth, and Kay the mother haunted by what she had lived through. Now, they were two older women who had both chosen not to let tragedy silence them. In their later years, both Kay and Sue came to the same quiet conclusion that Sharon and Annette had reached. Survival is not just about enduring. It's about choosing to live in ways that honor those you've lost. For Kay, that meant raising her family with honesty and love. For Sue, it meant ensuring that other cases did not go unheard. And for both, it meant that Renee's life, short as it had been, would never be forgotten. The years inside had ground Shane down in ways no courtroom sentence could have fully promised. At first, he had fought against the system with arrogance, clinging to the notion that appeals or technicalities might free him. Later, he settled into a routine of bitterness, convincing himself that everyone else had failed him. His lawyers, his family, the world itself. But age, as it always does, stripped him of the illusions. By his 70s, Shane's body had betrayed him. The man who once strutted in pressed uniforms and carried himself with false authority now shuffled through the prison corridors with a stoop. Arthritis stiffened his hands. His knees ached with every step. His hair was nearly gone, and his skin hung loose against his bones. Where he once prowled the prison yard, looking for ways to insert himself into others' conversations, now he sat alone, watching. Inmates younger than his own children barely acknowledged him. To them, he was just another relic, a man whose story they didn't know and didn't care to learn. The decline of his mind came more slowly, but just as cruelly. His memory faltered. He repeated stories. He confused guards' names. At times, he spoke of the past as if it were still unfolding, telling an uninterested cellmate that he had a daughter, and she was fine, she was always fine. But in the rare moments of lucidity, when his defenses cracked, a flicker of fear appeared in his eyes. Not fear of death, but fear of insignificance. For a man like Shane, obscurity was worse than punishment. He had built his life on being the center of a story, whether as the soldier, the husband, the father, or the defendant. To fade into nothingness was a fate he could never have imagined. His health spiraled further. A stroke weakened him. Diabetes required constant monitoring. Hospital visits became routine, though the prison infirmary offered little comfort. He spent long stretches in a wheelchair, staring out barred windows at skies he would never walk under freely again. Once, in the infirmary, a nurse asked if he wanted to call family. He shook his head. Pride, or perhaps shame, sealed his lips. There was no one waiting, no one willing. His children had built lives free from him. His ex-wives had long severed ties. The only name that remained tethered to him was Renee, and even that, in the outside world, was no longer his but hers. Prison records noted his decline clinically. Mobility impaired, limited capacity, requires assistance with daily tasks. But no record captured the hollowness of his final years, the absence of visitors, the silence of an empty cell, the slow fading of a man who had once believed he could control everything. For decades, Shane had loomed like a shadow over Sharon, Annette, Sue, and Kay. Now that shadow was shrinking, dissolving into the nothingness of a forgotten prisoner. His final days came quietly. No reporters, no family, no last-minute appeals. Just an old man in a prison infirmary bed, staring at the ceiling, his breath shallow and uneven. Whatever thoughts flickered in his mind remained unspoken. Regret, defiance, fear, the walls gave no answers. When he died, the notice was a single line in a state prison log. Inmate deceased. No headlines, no mourners, no legacy but the one others had written. Through Sharon's persistence, Annette's survival, Sue's determination, and Kay's resilience. In the end, Shane Goode became what he had always feared most: irrelevant. The years had carried them far from that courtroom, far from the tension of testimony and verdicts. Time had etched lines into their faces, slowed their steps, softened their voices. Yet for Sharon, Annette, Sue, and Kay, one thread never frayed. The bond forged through Renee's life and loss. It was Sharon who suggested they meet again, this time not for a vigil or a memorial, but simply to be together. "We've carried this for so long," she said. "Maybe it's time we sit down as women, not just as survivors." They gathered at a small lakeside cabin, chosen for its quiet and privacy. The cabin wasn't grand, but it was peaceful, the kind of place where time seemed to pause. The lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, and tall pines framed the horizon. Annette arrived with her canvases, offering to show the others her paintings. Kay brought home-cooked dishes, eager to feed the women who had once fed her spirit when she was broken. Sue, ever practical, carried folders of old notes and clippings, insisting they deserved to be preserved properly. Sharon, frail but determined, brought only herself, knowing her presence was enough. They spent the first day reminiscing, not just about Renee, but about themselves, about marriages and grandchildren, careers and retirements, struggles and victories. Their laughter filled the cabin, punctuated by moments of silence when memories pressed too heavy. At night, they sat around a fire, its glow warming their faces as the air cooled. Sharon's voice was the first to break the quiet. "I used to think justice was the end," she said softly, "but I've learned it's really the beginning. The verdict gave us space to live again. And living, that's what justice is." Annette nodded, her eyes fixed on the flames. "I carried so much guilt for so long. Guilt for trusting him, for not seeing, for not protecting her. But being here with all of you, I realize guilt doesn't keep Renee alive. Love does." Kay added, "For me, it was teaching my kids they didn't have to carry his shadow, that they could be different. Every day I chose that, it felt like I was choosing Renee too." Sue, the detective who had never stopped fighting, leaned back in her chair. "You all gave me purpose. I carried Renee's file because you carried her memory. She made me better at what I do, and she still does. Every case I ever touched after hers, I thought, don't let this family down. Don't let this child be forgotten." Silence settled over them again, not uncomfortable, but reverent. The fire cracked. A night bird called from the woods. Each woman knew they were near the twilight of their lives, but sitting together, they also knew they had done something extraordinary. They had refused to let one man's cruelty define their story. They had turned tragedy into testimony, pain into resilience, silence into voices that echoed beyond their own lives. The next morning, they held a small ritual by the lake. Sharon lit a candle. Annette placed one of her paintings, a bright, colorful canvas, against a tree. Kay read a letter she had written to Renee years earlier but never shared. Sue dropped a single stone into the water, watching the ripples spread. "Every year we've kept her alive," Sharon whispered, "and even when we're gone, she'll still be alive. Because of this." She gestured at the four of them, standing side by side. In that moment, they understood. Renee's legacy wasn't just a story of tragedy. It was a story of endurance, of women who refused to break, of love that survived decades of loss. As they parted from the cabin, each woman felt a sense of completion. Not closure. Grief never truly closes, but completion. They had carried Renee together, and they had carried one another. And that, they knew, was the truest form of justice. In the end, the story of Renee Goode was never just about one man's cruelty. It was never only about a courtroom battle or the prison walls that finally confined Shane. Those details mattered, yes. They carved the framework of the narrative. But the heart of it, the part that endured, was always about the women who carried her name forward. Renee was only 3 years old when her life was stolen. Too young to know the storm she had been caught in. Too innocent to understand betrayal. Yet through her absence, she became a force of presence. A child who could not speak for herself became the reason others found their voices. Sharon's voice was steady and unyielding. She refused to let grief silence her, becoming the anchor her family needed and the advocate strangers turned to for courage. Annette's voice was fractured at first, tangled in shame and guilt, but it grew into something fierce and unflinching, proof that survival is never neat but always possible. Kay's voice lived in the lives of her children, in the choices she made to raise them differently, to free them from the shadow of their father. And Sue's voice carried into courtrooms, classrooms, and case files across the state, reminding generations of detectives that persistence and empathy are the twin pillars of justice. Together, their voices ensured that Renee's name did not fade into a statistic. Shane Goode had once believed he controlled the story. He charmed, manipulated, and intimidated, certain that he could always bend the truth to his will. But time stripped him of that illusion. In prison, his power withered. His appeals ran dry. His name slipped into obscurity. His legacy was not the one he had sought. He was not remembered as a soldier or a husband or even as a father. He was remembered only as the man who took what could never be returned, and as the reason for women chose to fight back. In that, he was utterly defeated. And so the balance shifted. Renee, who lived just 3 years, became larger in death than Shane ever was in life. Her memory inspired change, comforted survivors, guided detectives, and bound for women in a bond stronger than blood. The candle Sharon lit every morning was not just for Renee, it was for resilience. The paintings Annette filled her home with were not just art. They were reclamations of a self once silenced. The children Kay raised were not just survivors of their father's shadow. They were testaments to the possibility of breaking cycles. The students and detectives Sue mentored were not just professionals. They were caretakers of truth in Renee's name. As time moved on, and as each woman's story reached its natural conclusion, Renee's did not end. Her life became a thread woven into countless others, a reminder that justice is not just verdicts, but choices, not just punishment, but perseverance. Her story became a quiet warning whispered to mothers, a lesson carried by officers, a spark in the hearts of survivors who realized they were not alone. And though her life was stolen before it had barely begun, the love she inspired outlasted the cruelty that ended it. When all the noise faded, the trials, the appeals, the headlines, the years, what remained was simple and undeniable. A child's memory, a family's love, a community's resilience. Renee Goode lived just 3 short years, but her story will live forever.